Hello, horror lovers. Welcome to our channel. Please subscribe. Your support is our biggest motivation. Let us know in the comments which part of the world you're listening from. If you like this video, don't forget to hit the like button. Now, let's get into the stories. It all began when I found myself standing at the foot of the infamous Amityville house. I never believe in paranormal phenomena, but something about this place always intrigued me. It was a rainy evening, and the house loomed large, its windows like dark eyes staring out at the street. I was there with a friend who shared my fascination with the macabre, and we decided to take a closer look. The house was abandoned, or at least it seemed so from the outside. We had heard stories of the family that had once lived here, of the gruesome murders that had taken place within these very walls. But despite the history, I never expected anything out of the ordinary. We were just two curious souls looking for a thrill. The front gate creaked as we pushed it open, and the air felt thick with moisture. And something I couldn't quite identify. It wasn't fear exactly, but a growing sense of unease that settled in the pit of my stomach. We made our way up the path, the rain dripping from the edges of the porch roof as we stood at the front door. For a moment, neither of us spoke, as if we were waiting for something, and then it happened. I felt a chill run down my spine as the door slowly creaked open on its own. I looked at my friend, but he just shrugged, clearly unnerved, but trying to play it cool. We stepped inside, our footsteps echoing through the empty house. The air inside was stale, and the faint smell of mildew hung in the air. The floors creaked under our weight as we moved from room to room, our flashlights cutting through the darkness. The house was just as you'd expect an old abandoned building to be, dusty, decaying, and forgotten. But there was something else too. Shadows seemed to shift at the edges of my vision, flickering in the corners of the room, as though something was moving just out of sight. I tried to ignore it, chalking it up to the low light and my overactive imagination. But the feeling of being watched persisted. We found ourselves in the living room, standing in front of the large fireplace that had been a focal point of the house in its heyday. The rain was coming down harder now, and the sound of it hitting the roof was almost deafening. My friend and I exchanged a glance, both of us feeling the weight of the history of this place. Then, without warning, the temperature in the room dropped. It was sudden, as if someone had opened a window, letting in a blast of cold air. But the windows were all shut tight, and there was no explanation for the chill that had settled around us. I shivered, my breath visible in the cold air, and that's when I saw it, a shadow, darker than the rest, moving across the far wall. I froze, unable to look away. The shadow was tall and thin, humanoid in shape, but distorted, as if it didn't belong in this world. It seemed to pulse, growing larger for a moment before shrinking back, almost like it was breathing. My friend gasped, and I knew he saw it too. We both stood there, rooted to the spot, watching as the shadow moved closer, slithering across the wall toward us. I could feel my heart pounding in my chest, but I couldn't move, I couldn't speak. It was as if the very air around me had thickened, holding me in place. The shadow stopped a few feet away from us, lingering for a moment before it slowly began to dissipate, fading into the darkness. The room warmed up almost immediately, and the sense of dread that had filled the space lifted, leaving us both standing there, shaken and confused. We didn't speak as we made our way back outside, the rain still pouring down in sheets. We were soaked by the time we reached the car, but neither of us cared. We just wanted to get as far away from that house as possible. As we drove away, I couldn't stop thinking about what we had seen. It wasn't just a shadow, it was something more. Something alive, intelligent, and malevolent. I've tried to rationalize it over the years, to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, a product of my own imagination. But deep down, I know the truth. That shadow wasn't a figment of my mind, it was real. And it's still there, lurking in the Amityville house, waiting for the next unsuspecting visitor to cross its path. It wasn't supposed to be anything more than a peaceful weekend getaway. My girlfriend Emily and I had been planning this trip for weeks, just the two of us, away from the noise of the city, holed up in a cozy little cabin in the woods. The idea was simple: unwind, disconnect, and enjoy each other's company without the distractions of our everyday lives. We were both excited, thinking of it as a much-needed escape. The drive to the cabin took longer than I expected. The winding roads seemed to stretch endlessly through the dense forest, the trees closing in around us as we drove deeper into the wilderness. By the time we arrived, the sun had already dipped below the horizon, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. The place was exactly as described: charming, rustic, and isolated. Perfect, we thought. We unloaded the car, bringing our bags inside, and I took a moment to survey our temporary home. It was small but comfortable, with a fireplace in the corner and a large window overlooking the woods. There was something serene about it, something calming. I could feel the tension of the city life melting away as I took a deep breath of the crisp, clean air. Emily started a fire while I unpacked the rest of our things. We settled in for the night, enjoying the warmth of the flames and the quiet of the forest outside. There was no cell service, no internet, just the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly what we needed. We spent the evening playing cards, talking, and laughing, the kind of relaxed conversation we hadn't had in a while. Eventually, we decided to call it a night. The bedroom was small but cozy, with a large, comfortable bed and a view of the forest outside. We fell asleep quickly, lulled by the sound of the wind whispering through the trees. I don't know what woke me up. It might have been a noise, or maybe just an unsettling feeling, but I found myself lying in the dark, staring up at the ceiling. The fire had gone out, and the room was cold. I reached for Emily, but her side of the bed was empty. Confused, I sat up, listening for any sound that might explain her absence. That's when I heard the faint creak of floorboards from the other side of the cabin. I got out of bed, moving quietly toward the door. As I stepped into the hallway, I noticed a dim light coming from the living room, flickering as if someone had just walked past it. My heart started to race, but I told myself it was probably just Emily, maybe getting a drink of water or stoking the fire. Emily. I called out softly, but there was no response. I moved toward the living room, the floorboards creaking under my feet. The light was coming from a small oil lamp on the coffee table, casting long shadows on the walls. I frowned, trying to remember if we had left it on, but something else caught my attention: a figure standing by the window, silhouetted against the glass. For a moment, I thought it was Emily, but as I stepped closer, I realized the figure was too tall, too broad-shouldered. My breath caught in my throat as I stopped in my tracks, the hairs on the back of my neck standing on end. "Who are you?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear. The figure turned slowly, and I found myself staring into the cold, empty eyes of a man I had never seen before. His face was gaunt, his skin pale, and there was something unsettling about the way he looked at me, like he was seeing right through me. I backed away, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. "Emily," I called out again, louder this time, but there was still no answer. The man took a step toward me, and I bolted, running back to the bedroom and slamming the door behind me. I leaned against it, my heart pounding in my chest, my thoughts a chaotic mess. I had to find Emily, had to get us out of here, but I was terrified of what might be waiting for me on the other side of that door. Suddenly, I heard footsteps approaching, slow and deliberate, and I froze, my breath hitching in my throat. The doorknob rattled, and I held my breath, praying it would stay shut. The footsteps stopped, and for a long moment there was silence. Then, just as I thought he might have gone, the door burst open with a force that sent me stumbling back. The man stood in the doorway, his expression unchanged, his eyes locked on mine. I had nowhere to run, nowhere to hide, and the realization sent a wave of panic crashing over me. "Where's Emily?" I shouted, but the man didn't answer. He just stared at me, unmoving, as if he were waiting for something desperate. I grabbed the nearest object, a heavy lamp pan, hurled it at him. The lamp shattered against the wall, missing him entirely, but the impact seemed to break whatever trance he was in. He took another step forward, and I did the only thing I could think of. I lunged at him, hoping to knock him down, to give myself a chance to escape. But as soon as I made contact, the world around me seemed to shift. The man vanished, and I found myself standing in the middle of the living room, alone. My heart was still racing, my mind struggling to process what had just happened. It was as if he had never been there at all. I didn't wait to find out if he would come back. I ran through the cabin, calling for Emily, but there was no sign of her. Panic set in as I searched every room, my voice growing hoarse from shouting her name. She was gone. Finally, I stumbled out the front door into the cold night air. I looked around, but the woods were dark, and there was no sign of her anywhere. My mind was a blur of fear and confusion as I ran to the cart, fumbling with the keys in my panic. The engine roared to life, and I sped down the dirt road, my hands trembling on the steering wheel. I didn't stop driving until I reached the nearest town, where I burst into the police station, barely coherent as I tried to explain what had happened. They searched the cabin, the woods, the surrounding area, but they never found Emily. The official report said she had disappeared without a trace, and to this day I don't know what happened to her. But I can't shake the feeling that the man I saw, the man who haunted that cabin, took her somewhere I could never reach. I've tried to move on, tried to forget that night, but it's impossible. I still wake up in the middle of the night, heart pounding, half expecting to see that man standing at the foot of my bed, staring at me with those cold, empty eyes. And sometimes, when I'm alone in the dark, I can almost hear her voice, calling out to me from somewhere far away, a place I can never go. The cabin still stands, a silent witness of whatever happened that night. People say it's cursed, that anyone who stays there is never quite the same when they leave, if they leave at all. And now I can't help but wonder if they're right, because whatever was in that cabin, whatever took Emily, it's still out there, waiting for its next victim. The abandoned factory on the outskirts of town had always been a place of intrigue and fear. For years it stood as a decay monument to the town's industrial past, a place where men and women had once toiled away, producing goods that fueled the economy, but that was decades ago. Now the factory was nothing more than a crumbling ruin, its once bustling halls silent, its machinery long since rusted into oblivion. I'd heard the stories. Of course everyone in town had. They said the factory was cursed, that the spirits of those who had died in accidents on the job still lingered within its walls. There were tales of ghostly apparitions, of strange noises that echoed through the empty corridors at night. But I never gave them much thought. Ghost stories were just that, stories. They were meant to scare children and keep teenagers from sneaking into places they weren't supposed to go. But then I took the night security job that was supposed to be temporary, just something to keep me afloat while I looked for something better. The pay was decent, and the hours, though long, were manageable. My job was simple: keep an eye on the place, make sure no one was breaking in, and report any suspicious activity to the authorities. It sounded easy enough, and for the first few weeks it was. The factory was eerie at night, no doubt about that. The wind would howl through the broken windows, causing the old metal doors to creak and groan. The shadows seemed to move on their own, playing tricks on my eyes as I made my rounds. But there was nothing out of the ordinary, nothing to suggest that the stories were true. That all changed one night in early autumn. I remember the night clearly. The air was crisp, the sky overcast, with a faint drizzle that slicked the ground and made the factory feel even more desolate than usual. I arrived at my post just before sunset, as I always did, and settled in for what I expected to be another uneventful shift. The first few hours passed without incident. I made my rounds, checking the perimeter, making sure the gates were secure, the usual routine. But as the night wore on, something began to feel off. It was subtle at first, a sense of unease that I couldn't quite place. The factory seemed quieter than usual, the darkness heavier, the shadows deeper. I tried to shake it off, telling myself it was just my imagination, that I was letting the old stories get to me. But then, just after midnight, I heard a faint metallic clang coming from somewhere deep within the factory. I froze, my heart skipping a beat. For a moment I thought it was just the wind, or maybe a piece of debris falling from the ceiling. But then it came again, louder this time, unmistakable. It sounded like something or someone was moving through the factory, disturbing the long-forgotten machinery. I grabbed my flashlight and set off in the direction of the noise, my pulse quickening with each step. The factory was a maze of dark corridors and vast, empty rooms, and as I made my way deeper into the building, the sense of unease grew stronger. The air was thick with dust, the floor littered with debris, and every sound seemed amplified. In the stillness of the night, I reached the old assembly line, where the machines had once hummed with activity. Now they stood silent, their gears rusted, their belts frayed and broken. The sound had come from this area, I was sure of it. But as I swept my flashlight across the room, I saw nothing out of the ordinary. The place was deserted, just as it had been for years. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move. I whipped the flashlight around, shining it towards the far end of the room. For a split second, I saw it, a figure standing in the shadows, watching me. It was just a glimpse, barely more than a silhouette, but it was enough to send a jolt of fear through me. I called out, demanding to know who was there, but there was no response. The figure disappeared into the darkness, leaving me alone with nothing but the echo of my own voice. I hesitated for a moment, torn between following and retreating back to the safety of the security office. But something compelled me to move forward to find out what or who I had seen. I made my way through the assembly line, stepping carefully over the debris, my flashlight cutting through the darkness. I reached the spot where the figure had been, but there was no sign of anyone. The room was empty, the shadows, thick and oppressive, pressing in from all sides, and then suddenly the lights flickered on. I nearly dropped my flashlight in surprise. The overhead lights, which hadn't worked in years, blazed to life, flooding the room with harsh, fluorescent light. For a moment I was blinded, my eyes struggling to adjust after so long in the dark. When my vision cleared, I saw that the room was no longer empty. The machines were running, their gears turning, their belts moving, as if they had never stopped. The air was filled with the deafening noise of machinery, the clang of metal on metal, the hiss of steam escaping from long-forgotten pipes. Workers moved about the room, their faces expressionless, their movements mechanical. They didn't seem to notice me, didn't acknowledge my presence as they went about their tasks. I stood frozen, unable to move, unable to comprehend what I was seeing. This was impossible. The factory had been abandoned for years, the machines dismantled, the workers long gone. And yet, here they were, as real as anything I had ever seen. But as I watched, I realized something was wrong. The workers' faces were pale, their eyes sunken, their skin stretched tight over their bones. They moved with a slow, jerky gait, as if their bodies were being controlled by some unseen force. And the air it was thick with the smell of rot and decay, a stench so overpowering it made me gag. I took a step back, my mind racing, trying to make sense of what I was seeing. But before I could move any further, the lights flickered again, and everything disappeared. The room was plunged back into darkness, the machines silent once more. The workers were gone, as if they had never been there at all. I stood there, shaking, my heart racing, trying to convince myself that I hadn't just seen what I had seen. But the smell lingered, the scent of death and decay clinging to the air, a reminder that what I had witnessed was real. I didn't finish my shift that night. I ran from the factory, my footsteps echoing through the empty corridors, the sound of the machinery still ringing in my ears. I never went back, never set foot in that cursed building again. I later learned that the factory had been the site of a tragic accident many years before. A gas leak had caused an explosion, killing dozens of workers. Their bodies were never recovered, buried beneath the rubble of the collapsed building. The factory had been abandoned ever since, left to rot as a monument to the lives lost. And now I understood why the factory was said to be cursed. The spirits of those workers were still there, trapped in an endless cycle of labor, their souls unable to find peace. They were the ones who had haunted the factory, the ones who had turned on the lights, who had made the machines run once more. I tried to forget about that night, to move on with my life, but the memories haunted me. I would wake up in a cold sweat, the sound of the machinery still ringing in my ears, the smell of rot still clinging to my nostrils. And sometimes, late at night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still see them, the ghostly figures of the workers toiling away in that abandoned factory, forever trapped in a nightmare that will never end. Working the night shift as a security guard wasn't exactly my dream job, but it paid the bills. The warehouse I was assigned to was massive and old, sprawling building filled with rows of stacked pallets and forgotten corners that seemed to stretch on forever. It was the kind of place where the silence felt heavy, where the shadows seemed darker than they should be. But I didn't mind. I preferred the quiet, the solitude. It gave me time to think, to unwind after the chaos of the day. The job was simple: patrol the perimeter, check the doors, and make sure everything was locked up tight. Most nights, nothing happened. I'd do my rounds, maybe watch a movie on my phone or read a book, and before I knew it, my shift would be over. But there was something different about that night, something that set my nerves on edge the moment I walked in. The air felt colder than usual, and the shadows seemed to cling to the walls, as if they were alive, watching me. I shook off the feeling, telling myself it was just my imagination. After all, I'd been working here for months without a single incident. There was no reason to think tonight would be any different. I started my rounds as usual, flashlight in hand, walking the length of the warehouse. The place was eerily quiet, the only sound the echo of my footsteps on the concrete floor. I checked the doors, the windows, and the loading docks. Everything was secure. But as I made my way down one of the long aisles, something caught my eye, a flicker of movement in the shadows at the far end of the building. I stopped, my heart skipping a beat as I focused on this spot. For a moment, there was nothing, just the stillness of the warehouse. But then I saw it again, a shadow that didn't quite belong, shifting in the darkness. I gripped my flashlight tighter, telling myself it was probably just a trick of the light, maybe a rat scurrying across the floor. But deep down, I knew it was something else, something that didn't fit with the quiet routine of my nights. Cautiously, I made my way toward the back of the warehouse, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The closer I got, the more uneasy I felt, like something was watching me, waiting for me to get closer. My breath caught in my throat as I reached the end of the aisle, shining the light into the shadows. There was nothing there, just stacks of pallets and crates, the same as always. I let out a shaky breath, laughing at myself for being so jumpy. It was nothing, just my imagination playing tricks on me. I turned to head back, but as I did, I heard a sound, a soft, scraping noise, like something being dragged across the floor. I froze, the hair on the back of my neck standing on end. The sound came again, closer this time, and I turned slowly, shining my flashlight back toward the source. The beam landed on one of the pallets, and for a split second I saw something, a dark shape, low to the ground, moving away from me. "Who's there?" I called out, my voice echoing in the empty warehouse. There was no answer, just the sound of my own breathing, loud and uneven in the silence. I took a step closer, trying to get a better look, but the shape was gone, swallowed by the shadows. I stood there for a long moment, my heart racing, trying to convince myself it was nothing, just a stray cat or maybe a piece of machinery settling in the dark. But the unease in my gut wouldn't go away. I decided to finish my rounds quickly, eager to get back to the security office where I could lock the door and watch the surveillance cameras from the safety of my chair. But as I walked back down the aisle, I couldn't shake the feeling that I wasn't alone, that something was following me, keeping just out of sight. I hurried through the rest of my patrol, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner where something could be hiding. By the time I made it back to the office, I was on edge, my hands shaking as I fumbled with the keys to lock the door behind me. I sat down at the desk, trying to calm my nerves, but the unease lingered, gnawing at the back of my mind. I pulled up the surveillance feed, watching the grainy black and white footage of the warehouse. Everything seemed normal, empty aisles, motionless crates, the occasional flicker of static. But then I noticed something strange. In the corner of the screen, near the back of the warehouse, one of the cameras was glitching, the image distorted by a ripple of static. I leaned in closer, adjusting the focus to get a better look. The distortion cleared for a moment, and I saw it again, a dark shape, low to the ground, moving across the floor. But before I could make out any details, the screen went black, the camera feed cutting out completely. My heart pounded in my chest as I switched to another camera, but it too was dead, the screen filled with static. One by one, the cameras went dark, until I was left staring at a wall of static, a warehouse hidden from view. A cold sweat broke out on my forehead as I realized I was completely cut off, alone in the dark with whatever was out there. I tried the radio, but it was dead, just a crackle of static in response. Panic set in as I grabbed my flashlight and the spare keys, determined to get out of the building and find help. I unlocked the door and stepped out into the hallway, my flashlight flickering as I made my way toward the exit. The warehouse was completely dark now, the only light coming from my flickering beam. Every shadow seemed to move every creak of the floor sending a jolt of fear through me. I reached the main doors and fumbled with the keys, my hands shaking so badly I could barely fit them into the lock. But just as I got the door unlocked, I heard it again, that soft, scraping noise, coming from right behind me. I spun around, shining my flashlight into the darkness, but there was nothing there, just the empty hallway stretching back into the warehouse. My heart was in my throat as I turned back to the door, but before I could open it, something grabbed me, cold, rough hands pulling me back into the darkness. I screamed, dropping the flashlight as I fought to break free, but the grip was too strong, dragging me deeper into the warehouse. I kicked and thrashed, trying to get away, but it was like fighting against a tide, the darkness swallowing me. Hold up, my vision blurred as I was pulled across the floor, the world spinning around me. I caught glimpses of the warehouse, the stacks of pallets and crates passing by in a blur, but everything was distorted, like I was looking through a cracked lens. Finally, the pulling stopped, and I was dropped onto the cold concrete floor. I lay there, gasping for breath, my body trembling with fear. I tried to get up, to crawl away, but my limbs felt heavy, like they were weighed down by an invisible force, and then I saw the dark shape looming over me. It was taller now, more defined, but its features were still hidden in shadow. I could feel its eyes on me, cold and empty, and I knew that whatever it wasn't human. It leaned down, its face inches from mine, and I could feel its breath on my skin, icy and suffocating. My mind screamed at me to run, to fight, to do something, but I was frozen, paralyzed by fear. The last thing I remember is the sound of its voice, low and rasping, whispering something I couldn't understand. And then everything went black. When I woke up, I was lying outside the warehouse, the sun just beginning to rise. My body ached, and my head was pounding, but I was alive. I didn't know how I had gotten there, or what had happened to me in the darkness. But I knew one thing for certain: I was never going back to that warehouse again. I quit my job that day, and I've never spoken about what happened to anyone. But sometimes when I close my eyes, I can still see that dark shape, feel its cold breath on my skin, and I can't help but wonder, what was it, and why did it let me go? My name is Carlos, and for 10 long years I worked as a night shift nurse at San Juan General Hospital. In all my years there, I had seen my share of strange things: people clinging to life, others losing it in an instant, and the grieving families left behind. But nothing could have prepared me for what happened during my last month at the hospital, a month that still haunts me to this day. San Juan General was an old building, a relic from the early 20th century that had been renovated more times than I could count. The walls were thick, the corridors long and winding, and the windows narrow and high up, giving the place a feeling of being closed off from the outside world. The night shift was always quieter, of course, but there was something about the hospital at night that felt different. It wasn't just the silence or the dim lighting. It was the way the shadows seemed to stretch longer, the way the building seemed to breathe around you, the way the air felt colder as the night went on. That last month, the hospital was understaffed, as usual. Budget cuts had forced the administration to make do with fewer nurses, and those of us who were left had to pick up the slack. My workload increased, and so did my stress levels. I was working longer hours, sometimes going days without a proper rest. I told myself it was just the fatigue, that the things I was seeing weren't real, but deep down I knew better. It started with small things, items going missing, only to reappear in places I was sure I hadn't left them. A stethoscope that I'd hung around my neck would vanish, only to be found later in a patient's room. Papers would be shuffled on my desk, files moved from one cabinet to another. I tried to laugh it off, chalking it up to exhaustion, but the unease lingered. Then there were the noises, soft whispers that seemed to come from nowhere, footsteps echoing down empty hallways, doors creaking open and shut on their own. More than once, I heard the sound of a child laughing, but when I went to investigate, I found nothing but an empty corridor. The other nurses noticed it, too, but we didn't talk about it. We just exchanged uneasy glances and got on with our work, pretending that nothing was wrong. But the worst was yet to come. One night I was assigned to the pediatric ward, a place I had always hated working. There was something about that ward that made my skin crawl. Something about the way the cribs and small beds were lined up in perfect rows, the way the toys sat silently on the shelves, as if waiting for children who would never come. The pediatric ward was on the 3rd floor, far from the hustle and bustle of the emergency room, and at night it was eerily quiet. It was around 2 a.m. when I first heard the sound of a child crying. It was faint at first, so faint I thought I was imagining it, but as I listened it grew louder, more insistent. It was coming from one of the rooms at the end of the hall. I hurried down the corridor, my heart racing. The pediatric ward was empty at night, all the children having been transferred to another hospital for a specialized procedure. I knew that, but I couldn't ignore the sound. When I reached the room, the crying stopped. The door was ajar, and I pushed it open slowly, my hands trembling. The room was dark, the only light coming from the small nightlight plugged into the wall. The bed was empty, the covers neatly folded just as I had left them. I stepped inside, my eyes scanning the room for any sign of the child I had heard. But there was nothing, no child, no toes out of place, no sign that anyone had been there at all. I was about to leave when I saw the rocking chair in the corner of the room, slowly moving back and forth on its own. My breath caught in my throat, and I froze, unable to look away. The chair creaked as it rocked, the sound loud in the stillness of the room. I watched, paralyzed, as it continued to move, the air growing colder around me. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. I don't remember how long I stood there, staring at that chair, my mind racing. Eventually, I forced myself to move, to leave the room and close the door behind me. I told myself it was just a draft, that the chair had moved because of the wind, even though I knew there were no open windows. I tried to convince myself that it was nothing, that I was just tired, but the fear lingered. The next few nights were worse. The crying became more frequent, more desperate. Sometimes it was a child, sometimes a baby, but always it was the same heart-wrenching sound that echoed through the empty halls, drawing me back to that room at the end of the corridor. Each time I found the room empty, the bed untouched, the rocking chair still. But I could feel the presence in the room, the cold that seeped into my bones, the sense that I was being watched. I started to avoid the pediatric ward, making excuses to the other nurses, trading shifts whenever I could. But it didn't matter. The crying followed me, echoing in my mind, even when I wasn't on duty. I began to dread going to work, the fear gnawing at me, making it impossible to sleep. I was unraveling, and I knew it. And then, on my last night at the hospital, it happened. I was working in a busy night with a steady stream of patients coming in. The chaos of the emergency room was a welcome distraction from the horrors of the pediatric ward. But I couldn't escape the feeling that something was wrong. The crying had been louder than ever the night before, and I knew that it was only a matter of time before something terrible happened. It was around 3 a.m. when the power went out. The entire hospital was plunged into darkness, the emergency lights flickering on, casting eerie shadows on the walls. The generators kicked in. that the lights remained dim, the atmosphere heavy with tension. The other nurses and I scrambled to keep things under control, but the sense of unease was palpable. And then I heard it, the crying, louder than ever, echoing through the halls. It was coming from the pediatric ward. I knew it without even having to think. My heart raced, my hands shaking as I tried to focus on my work, to ignore the sound. But I couldn't. It was like a siren call, pulling me towards the source of the noise, compelling me to find the child who was crying out for help. I don't know what made me do it, but I left leaving the chaos behind as I made my way up to the 3rd floor. The hallways were empty. The only sound, the faint hum of the emergency lights, and the soft, persistent crying that seemed to grow louder with each step. By the time I reached the pediatric ward, the crying had become a wail, a desperate, haunting sound that made my skin crawl. The door to the room at the end of the hall was wide open, and I could see the rocking chair moving back and forth, the sound of its creaking mingling with the cries. I stepped inside, my heart pounding, the air thick with the smell of antiseptic and something else, something rotten. The room was freezing, my breath visible in the dim light. I felt a presence behind me, something cold and malevolent, but I couldn't turn around. My eyes were locked on the bed, where I now saw a small figure lying under the covers. I knew there was no one else in the hospital who could have been in that room, yet there was a child lying there, shivering under the blanket. I approached the bed slowly, every instinct screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but I couldn't stop myself. The closer I got, the colder it became, the crying reaching a fever pitch, so loud it felt like it was inside my head. I reached out to pull back the blanket, to see the child's face, to comfort them, but as my hand touched the fabric, the crying stopped. Silence filled the room, so complete it was deafening. The cold receded, the air still and heavy. I pulled back the blanket, expecting to find a child in distress, but there was nothing. The bed was empty, just as it had been every other night, but the sheets were warm, as if someone had just been lying there, and the smell of decay was stronger than ever. I stumbled back, my mind reeling, and that's when I saw it, the shadow in the corner of the room, tall and thin, its eyes glowing in the darkness. It was watching me, its gaze cold and unfeeling, and as I stared back, I felt a wave of terror unlike anything I had ever known. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe, couldn't think. All I could do was stand there, frozen in place, as the shadow began to move towards me. I don't remember how I got out of that room, how I made it back to the yacht. The next thing I knew, I was outside, the cool night air filling my lungs, the distant sounds of the city bringing me back to reality. I quit my job the next day, left the hospital without so much as a word to anyone. I couldn't go back, couldn't face whatever it was that I had encountered in that room. To this day, I don't know what I saw that night, whether it was a ghost, a demon, or something else entirely. But I do know one thing: I am not the only one who's experienced it. The other nurses, the doctors, the patients, they've all heard the crying, felt the cold, seen the shadows. San Juan General is a haunted place, cursed by something dark and terrible, something that feeds on fear and suffering. I moved away from the city, far from the hospital, far from the memories. But even now I can't escape it. I still hear the crying sometimes, in the dead of night, echoing through my dreams. I wake up in a cold sweat. The image of that shadowy figure burned into my mind, a constant reminder that some things can't be explained, that some places are better left forgotten, and I know, deep down, that no matter how far I run, I'll never be free of the haunted hospital of San Juan. I grew up in a small town, nestled in the heart of the Appalachian Mountains, a place where everyone knew each other, and secrets were hard to keep. But there was one secret that the town kept well, a dark one that no one ever spoke about. It was about the hidden grove, a dense forest just outside of town that was said to be cursed. No one ever went there, and if they did, they never came back. I never believed in the stories. They seemed like nothing more than old wives' tales, meant to scare kids into staying out of the woods. But that all changed one night when I decided to take a dare that would change my life forever. It was a Friday night, and a group of us had gathered at the old quarry for a bonfire. We were drinking, laughing, and sharing ghost stories when someone brought up the hidden grove. The air grew tense as we all fell silent, listening to the crackling of the fire. The mention of the grove always did that. No one wanted to talk about it, but the curiosity was always there, lurking in the back of our minds. "Bet you wouldn't last a night in there," said Jake, one of my oldest friends. He was always the one to push the boundaries, to see how far we could go before turning back. "Are you kidding?" I laughed, trying to brush off the unease that had settled over the group. "There's nothing in there but trees and shadows. You all believe in fairy tales. Prove it," Jake said, his eyes gleaming with challenge. "Spend the night in the hidden grove, and I'll give you $50. I hesitated, my mind racing. $50 wasn't much, but the bragging rights alone were worth it. Plus, it was a chance to finally prove that the stories were just that, stories. "Fine," I said, standing up and grabbing my jacket. "I'll do it." The others tried to talk me out of it, but my mind was made up. I was going to spend the night in the hidden grove, and when I came back in the morning, I'd have the last laugh. Jake handed me a flashlight and a knife. "Just in case," he said with a grin. The walk to the grove was uneventful, the path lit only by the full moon overhead. The forest was quiet, the only sounds the rustling of leaves in the wind and the occasional hoot of an owl. As I reached the edge of the hidden grove, a sense of dread washed over me, but I shook it off. It was just nerves, I told myself. Nothing more. The grove was darker than I expected, the trees packed so tightly together that they blocked out most of the moonlight. I switched on the flashlight, the beam cutting through the darkness as I ventured deeper into the woods. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying leaves, and the further I went, the harder it was to ignore the feeling that I was being watched. After what felt like hours, I found a small clearing and decided to set up camp. I laid out my sleeping bag and sat down, trying to ignore the unease that had settled in my stomach. I told myself it was just the isolation, the unfamiliarity of being alone in the woods at night. But then I heard a soft, rhythmic chanting coming from deep within the grove. My blood ran cold as I realized I wasn't alone. I grabbed the knife, my hands trembling as I listened to the voices growing louder, closer. They were chanting in a language I didn't understand, their voices low and menacing. I switched off the flashlight and crouched low, my heart pounding in my chest. The chanting grew louder until it seemed to be coming from all around me, echoing through the trees. I was terrified, every instinct telling me to run, to get out of there before it was too late. But my legs wouldn't move. I was frozen in place, paralyzed by fear. And then I saw them figures emerging from the shadows, dressed in long, dark robes that hid their faces. They moved slowly, deliberately, forming a circle around the clearing. I counted at least a dozen of them, their chanting growing louder with each step they took. I wanted to scream, to call for help, but I knew it would do no good. No one would hear me out here, and even if they did, they wouldn't be able to get to me in time. I was trapped, surrounded by these faceless figures, their voices weaving together in a haunting melody that sent shivers down my spine. The leader stepped forward, a tall figure with a hood that obscured his face completely. He held something in his hands, and as he raised it above his head, The chanting reached a fever pitch. The object caught the light of the moon, and I realized with horror that it was a knife, its blade gleaming in the darkness. The leader began to chant louder, his voice rising above the others as he lowered the knife, pointing it toward me. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest, but there was nowhere to go. The circle closed in around me, the figures pressing closer, their chanting filling my ears until I thought I would go mad from the sound. I closed my eyes, waiting for the knife to strike, but it never did. Instead, the chanting stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that was even more terrifying. I opened my eyes to find the figures standing still, their heads bowed as if in prayer, and then, as suddenly as they had appeared, they were gone, vanishing into the shadows without a sound. The clearing was empty. The only sign that they had been there, the cold sweat on my skin, and the lingering echo of their voices in my mind. I didn't wait to see if they would come back. I grabbed my things and ran, tearing through the woods as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I was out of the grove, the first rays of dawn breaking through the trees. When I made it back to the quarry, the others were still there, their faces pale with fear as they saw me stumble out of the woods. Jake rushed over, his eyes wide with disbelief. "Man, what happened to you?" he asked, but I couldn't answer. I could barely speak, my mind still reeling from what I had seen, from the terror that had gripped me in that dark, cursed grove. I never told anyone what really happened that night, and I never went back to the hidden grove, but sometimes, late at night, I can still hear the chanting, still see those faceless figures closing in around me, and I know that the grove isn't just a story, it's a place of darkness, a place where the old legends come to life, and where those who venture in might never come back. My name is David, and I have always been a skeptic when it comes to the supernatural. Ghosts, curses, haunted places, it all seemed like nonsense to me. I grew up in a small town where everyone knew everyone, and the only real mystery was what kind of pie Mrs. Jenkins would bring to the church bake sale. But that all changed one summer when I was 22. It was the summer I found the mirror. It started with a dare. My friends and I were hanging out in a park one lazy afternoon, bored out of our minds. That's when Tommy, always the troublemaker, suggested we explore the old mansion on the outskirts of town. The mansion had been abandoned for years, ever since the wealthy family who owned it had all died under mysterious circumstances. People in town whispered about curses and ghosts, but I didn't buy into any of that. "Come on, David," Tommy said, a mischievous grin on his face. "I bet you're too chicken to go in there." I rolled my eyes, but I couldn't back down from a challenge. "Fine," I said. "Let's go." The mansion was a sprawling, crumbling structure, surrounded by overgrown gardens and hidden behind a rusty, wrought-iron gate. The windows were broken, the walls covered in ivy, and the front door hung off its hinges. As we approached, I felt a shiver of unease, but I pushed it aside, determined to prove that there was nothing to be afraid of. We squeezed through the gate and made our way up the weed-choked path to the front door. The wood creaked under our feet as we stepped inside, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The floor was grand, or at least it had been at one time. Now it was filled with broken furniture, shattered glass, and peeling wallpaper. The only light came from the sun streaming through the gaps in the boarded-up windows, casting long shadows across the floor. "Let's split up," Tommy suggested. "We'll cover more ground that way." I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I didn't want to show any fear. "Fine," I said, heading down a hallway to the left. The mansion was a labyrinth of narrow corridors, dark rooms and staircases that seemed to lead nowhere. The further I went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. I could feel the weight of the building pressing down on me, the silence broken only by the sound of my footsteps echoing through the empty halls. Every now and then I thought I heard something, a faint whisper, a creak of floorboards, but I convinced myself it was just the wind or the old house settling. After what felt like hours of wandering, I stumbled upon a large room at the back of the house. It was clearly the master bedroom, or at least it had been at one time. The bed was massive, though the mattress had long since rotted away, and the curtains were tattered, hanging limply around the windows. But what caught my attention was the mirror. It was an ornate, full-length mirror standing in one corner of the room. The frame was made of dark wood, intricately carved with strange symbols and designs. Despite the decay that had taken over the rest of the house, the mirror was pristine, the glass untouched by dust or dirt. It was almost as if it had been protected, preserved from the ravages of time. I approached the mirror, drawn to it in a way I couldn't explain. There was something mesmerizing about it, something that made it impossible to look away. As I stood in front of it, I saw my reflection, but there was something off. The room behind me in the mirror didn't match the one I was standing in. In the reflection, the room was whole, untouched by time. The bed was made, the curtains were new, and the walls were clean. And there, in the reflection, stood a woman. She was beautiful, dressed in an elegant gown that looked like it belonged in the 19th century. Her hair was dark, cascading down her back in loose waves, and her eyes were fixed on mine. She wasn't standing behind me, though. No, she was inside the mirror, as if she were part of the reflection itself. My heart began to race as I stared at her, unable to move, unable to look away. Her lips curled into a smile, but it wasn't a kind smile. It was cold, calculating, and there was something in her eyes that sent a chill down my spine. I wanted to run, to get out of that room, out of that house, but I was frozen in place. Then she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, but I heard it as clearly as if she were standing right next to me. "Help me," she said. "Free me." I felt a surge of panic. This wasn't real. It couldn't be real. I was just tired, just imagining things. But the longer I stood there, the more real it felt. The woman's eyes bore into mine, pleading, desperate. I didn't know what to do. I wanted to help her, but I didn't know how. "Break the mirror," she whispered. "Please, you must break the mirror." My hand trembled as I reached out to touch the glass. It was cold, so cold it burned. I pulled my hand back, my mind racing. This was insane. I couldn't break the mirror. What if it was all just a trick of the light, a hallucination brought on by the musty air and the darkness? But the woman's eyes were so sad, so pleading. I took a deep breath, trying to calm myself. "I can't," I whispered back. "I'm sorry, I can't." Her expression changed in an instant. The sadness vanished, replaced by anger, rage. Her eyes darkened, her face twisting into a mask of fury. "You must," she screamed, her voice echoing through the room, through my mind. "You must free me." The mirror shook on its stand, the glass rippling as if it were water. I stumbled back, my heart pounding in my chest. This couldn't be happening. This wasn't real. But it felt real, more real than anything I had ever experienced. I turned to run, to get out of that room, but the door slammed shut before I could reach it. I was trapped, the air growing colder by the second, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The woman's screams filled the room, filled my head, drowning out everything else. I covered my ears, trying to block it out, but it was no use. The sound was inside me, tearing me apart. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, it stopped. The room was silent, the air still, I lowered my hands, my body trembling. The mirror was quiet, the glass smooth and still. The woman was gone, her image replaced by my own reflection, pale and terrified. I didn't waste any time. I threw open the door and ran, not stopping until I was outside, gasping for breath in the cool evening air. My friends were waiting for me, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear. They had heard the screams too, they said. They had felt the house shake, felt the cold seep into their bones. We didn't say anything as we left, didn't look back as we made our way down the overgrown path and out through the gate. I didn't sleep that night. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her face, heard her voice, felt the cold grip of fear around my heart. The next day I tried to put it out of my mind, tried to convince myself that it had all been a bad dream. But deep down I knew better. A few days later, I couldn't resist the urge to go back. I had to know if the mirror was still there, if the woman was still trapped inside. I told myself it was just curiosity, but I knew it was more than that. It was a compulsion, a need that I couldn't explain. When I returned to the mansion, I found it just as we had left it, crumbling, decayed, silent. I made my way back to the master bedroom, my heart pounding in my chest. The mirror was still there, standing in the corner, as pristine as ever. But this time there was no woman, no strange reflection. Just me, staring back at myself. Relief washed over me. But it was short-lived. As I turned to leave, I caught a glimpse of something in the corner of my eye. The mirror's reflection had changed again, showing not just the room behind me, but the entire household and untouched by time. And there, standing in the doorway behind me, was the woman. She wasn't smiling this time. Her face was twisted in anger, her eyes filled with hatred. I didn't wait to see what would happen next. I ran, faster than I had ever run in my life, out of the mansion, out of the garden, and back to the safety of my own home. I never went back to the mansion after that. I tried to forget about the mirror, about the woman trapped inside, but it wasn't easy. I couldn't shake the feeling that she was still watching me, still waiting for me to return. And sometimes, late at night, I hear her voice in my dreams, whispering to me, begging me to free her. But I can't, I won't, because deep down, I know that whatever she is, whatever she wants, it's not something I can understand. And I'm terrified of what might happen if I do as she asks. So I stay away from the mansion, away from the cursed mirror, and I try to live my life as best I can. But no matter how hard I try, I can't escape the feeling that I am being watched, that she's still out there, waiting. And one day I fear I might not be able to resist the pull of the mirror any longer. The drive out to the cabin was supposed to be a peaceful escape from the noise and stress of city life. I had rented a small, secluded place deep in the woods, miles away from the nearest town, with the idea of spending a quiet weekend reading and unwinding. I was looking forward to the solitude, the crisp air, and the absence of anything resembling civilization. The road to the cabin was long and winding, cutting through dense forest with towering pines on either side. The further I drove, the less I saw of the sky, until the trees formed a canopy above, casting everything in a greenish gloom. The GPS had lost signal a while back, but I wasn't worried. The directions I'd printed out seemed straightforward enough. Just follow the dirt road until it ends, and the cabin would be there, waiting for me. But as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the forest floor, I started to feel uneasy. The cabin was supposed to be at the end of the road, but after driving for what felt like hours, there was still no sign of it. The trees seemed to close in around me, their branches reaching out like twisted fingers, blocking out what little light remained. I considered turning back, but the thought of navigating that narrow road in the dark wasn't appealing. I decided to press on, figuring the cabin had to be closed. I was just about to convince myself that I'd missed a turn somewhere when the road suddenly widened, and there it was, a small, weathered cabin nestled in a clearing, surrounded by trees on all sides. Relief washed over me as I pulled up and parked the car. The cabin looked old, but it was charming in a rustic way, with a stone chimney and a porch that wrapped around the front. The windows were dark, and the air was filled with the sound of crickets and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. It was exactly what I had hoped for, peaceful, secluded, and miles away from everything. I grabbed my bag and headed inside. The cabin was just as quaint on the inside as it was on the outside. There was a small living room with a stone fireplace, a kitchen with old-fashioned appliances, and a single bedroom in the back. I set my things down and opened the windows to let in the cool evening air. As I unpacked, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but I chalked it up to nerves. It had been a long drive, and I was tired. A good night's sleep would do me good. After a quick dinner, I settled down with a book by the fireplace, the crackling of the flames the only sound in the cabin. But as the night wore on, the feeling of unease grew stronger. Every creak of the wood, every rustle outside, made me jump. I tried to focus on my book, but my eyes kept drifting to the windows, expecting to see someone out there in the darkness. It wasn't long before I decided to call it a night. I locked the doors, checked the windows, and crawled into bed, pulling the covers up to my chin. But sleep didn't come easily. The forest outside was too quiet, the kind of quiet that presses in on you, making you hyper-aware of every little sound. And then I heard a low growl somewhere in the distance. I sat up, my heart racing. The growl came again, closer this time, followed by the sound of something heavy moving through the underbrush. I held my breath, straining to hear over the pounding in my chest. It sounded like an animal, but there was something about the noise that made my skin crawl. It was too deliberate, too controlled, as if whatever was out there knew exactly where it was going. I got out of bed and grabbed the flashlight from my bag. My hands were shaking as I clicked it on and moved to the window. The beam of light cut through the darkness. What all I could see were trees and shadows. The growling had stopped, but the air was thick with tension, as if the forest itself was holding its breath. I stood there for what felt like an eternity, the flashlight beam flickering slightly as I scanned the trees. Just as I was about to turn away, I saw its glowing eyes staring back at me from the edge of the clearing. They were too high off the ground to belong to any normal animal, and the shape behind them was massive, hunched over in a way that made my blood run cold. The eyes blinked, and then the creature stepped into the light. It was unlike anything I had ever seen, tall and muscular, with a canine-like face and thick, matted fur that glistened in the moonlight. It stood on two legs, its long arms hanging at its sides, ending in sharp claws that looked like they could tear through flesh with ease. The thing was watching me, studying me, its breath visible in the cold night air. I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. All I could do was stare back at it, my mind racing with disbelief and terror. This wasn't possible. Creatures like this didn't exist. But it was there, standing at the edge of the clearing, its eyes locked on mine. And then it moved slowly, deliberately, taking a step forward. I stumbled back, nearly dropping the flashlight. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it would burst out of my chest. The creature took another step, and I knew I had to do something, anything, to get out of there. I bolted for the front door, throwing it open and sprinting toward the car. I didn't dare look back, but I could hear it behind me, crashing through the underbrush, gaining on me with every second. My hands fumbled with the keys as I reached the car, but I managed to get the door open and threw myself inside, slamming the door shut just as the creature reached the clearing dot. It was on the porch now, its claws scratching at the wood as it let out a deafening roar. I turned the key in the ignition, praying the engine would start. For a terrifying moment, nothing happened, but then the car roared to life, and I floored it, tearing down the dirt road as fast as I could. I didn't stop until I reached the main road, my hands gripping the steering wheel so tightly my knuckles were white. I glanced in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see the creature chasing after me, but the road was empty. The trees thinned out, and soon I was back in familiar territory, the lights of a nearby town visible in the distance. I didn't go back to the cabin. I didn't even go back for my things. I drove straight home, my mind racing with what I had seen, what I had barely escaped. I tried to rationalize it, to tell myself it was just my imagination, that the darkness and isolation had played tricks on me. But deep down, I knew the truth. The creature I saw was real. It was out there, somewhere in those woods, waiting. And I knew, without a doubt, that I had come far too close to something that was never meant to be found. The call came late one evening, just as I was getting ready to leave the hospital after a long shift. I'm Dr. Michael Lane, and I've been working as a physician for over 20 years. Hollow Creek Hospital was a place with a reputation, one that people didn't talk about openly, but everyone knew. It was the kind of place where strange things happened, things that defied explanation, and over the years, the stories had built up to the point where the hospital was as much a legend as it was a medical facility. The hospital had been around since the 1920s, a relic of a bygone era, with its Gothic architecture and labyrinthine hallways. It had been through the flu pandemic, 2 world wars, and countless other crises. The walls had absorbed the sorrow, the pain, and the death of thousands of patients. The staff turnover was high, and those who stayed either didn't believe in the stories or didn't talk about them. That evening, as I was packing up to go home, the charge nurse, Maggie, approached me with a concerned look on her face. "Dr. Lane," she said, "there's a situation in Ward C. Ward C was the oldest part of the hospital, rarely used except for overflow or when we needed to isolate patients. It was a grim, dreary place, full of shadows and a persistent chill that never seemed to go away, no matter how high the heat was turned up. I'd always avoid Ward C whenever possible, but something in Maggie's voice made me stop. "What's going on?" I asked. "It's Mr. Reynolds," she said, lowering her voice. "He single quotes us ... well, he's saying things." "Like what?" "Just ... things that don't make sense. And he's been seeing things, too. People that aren't there." I sighed, rubbing the back of my neck. Mr. Reynolds was an elderly man who had been admitted with pneumonia a few days earlier. He was a bit delirious from the fever, which wasn't unusual in patients his age, but Maggie's tone suggested there was more to it than just a fevered imagination. "Okay," I said, "I'll take a look." I followed Maggie down the long, dimly lit corridor toward C. The hallways were eerily quiet, the fluorescent lights flickering occasionally, casting long, wavering shadows on the walls. We passed empty rooms, their doors slightly ajar, revealing the darkened interiors. As we approached Mr. Reynolds' room, I felt a cold draft. Though there were no windows nearby, Maggie hesitated outside the door, and I could see the unease in her eyes. "He's been asking for you," she said. "For me?" I asked, surprised. I had only met Mr. Reynolds once during his admission. He wasn't a regular patient of mine, and I couldn't think of any reason why he would specifically request me. She nodded. He said you're the only one who can help him. I pushed open the door and stepped inside. The room was dimly lit by a single overhead light, casting a sickly yellow glow over everything. Mr. Reynolds lay in the bed, his thin frame barely making an impression on the mattress. He looked pale, almost ghostly, his eyes wide and filled with something I couldn't quite place, fear, maybe, or something darker. Mr. Reynolds, I said softly as I approached the bed. It's Dr. Lane. How are you feeling? His eyes flicked to mine, and for a moment I saw a flicker of recognition. Doctor, he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper, you have to help me. They won't leave me alone. Who won't leave you alone? I asked, keeping my voice calm and steady. The people, he said, his eyes darting around the room. They keep coming. They whisper to me, tell me things, horrible things. I glanced at Maggie, who was standing by the door, her face pale. What people? I asked, turning back to Mr. Reynolds. He shook his head weakly. The ones who died here, they're trapped. They want me to join them. A chill ran down my spine. Hallucinations were common in patients with high fevers, but this felt different, more intense. Mr. Reynolds, there's no one here but us, I said gently. They're here, he insisted, his voice rising slightly. I see them every night, standing at the foot of my bed. They look at me, waiting. I didn't know what to say. There was nothing in the room, no shadows, no figures, just the two of us. But the fear in his eyes was real, palpable. Mr. Reynolds, try to rest. You're not alone. We're here to take care of you. He grabbed my hand, his grip surprisingly strong. You have to stop them, he pleaded. They won't let me die. They keep pulling me back. I tried to reassure him, but his words sent a shiver down my spine. There was something in the way he spoke, something that made me feel like he wasn't just talking about fever-induced delusions. But I pushed those thoughts aside. I had a duty to my patient, and that meant staying calm and professional. I'll do what I can, I promised. Though I wasn't sure what I could do, I stayed with Mr. Reynolds for a while longer, trying to calm him down. But it was clear that he was deeply disturbed. Eventually, I had to leave, and I instructed Maggie to keep an eye on him and to call me if anything changed. As I walked back to my office, I couldn't shake the feeling of unease that had settled over me. Mr. Reynolds' words echoed in my mind, and I found myself thinking about the stories I heard over the years, stories of patients who had seen things in Ward C, who'd spoken of ghosts and spirits haunting the old hospital. I had always dismissed them as just that, stories, but now I wasn't so sure. That night I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Mr. Reynolds' face, his terrified expression, his desperate pleas. I kept thinking about what he had said, about the people who had died in the hospital, about the possibility that their spirits might still be lingering, trapped in the place where they had at their end. The next day, I returned to the hospital, determined to check on Mr. Reynolds and reassure myself that it had all been a product of his fevered mind. But when I arrived at Ward C, I was met with grim news. Mr. Reynolds had passed away during the night. I felt a pang of guilt, wondering if there was something more I could have done, something I had missed. But when I saw the look on Maggie's face, I knew there was more to the story. He was fine when I checked on him, she said, her voice trembling. But then, then something happened. I don't know how to explain it, doctor. The room got so cold, and I heard voices, whispering. I thought it was just my imagination. But then Mr. Reynolds, he started to convulse. He kept saying they wouldn't let him go. I stared at her, my heart pounding in my chest. What do you mean? They wouldn't let him go? He was gasping, like he couldn't breathe, but his vitals were normal. I tried to help him, but it was like something was holding him down, keeping him here. And then then he just stopped. He looked at me, and for a moment, he wasn't afraid anymore. He looked relieved, and then he was gone. I didn't know what to say. There was no medical explanation for what she was describing, no way to rationalize it, but the look in her eyes told me that she believed every word of it. After Mr. Reynolds' death, things started to change in Ward C. The nurses reported strange occurrences, lights flickering on and off, cold drafts that came out of nowhere, and shadows that seemed to move on their own. Patients who were placed in the ward became agitated, claiming to see people in their rooms, hearing voices that no one else could hear. Some even said they felt a presence, something malevolent, watching them. The hospital administration tried to downplay it, attributing the incidents to the old building and the stress of being in a hospital environment. But those of us who worked there knew better. There was something in Ward C, something that couldn't be explained away so easily. One night, a few weeks after Mr. Reynolds' death, I was working late, reviewing charts in my office. The hospital was quiet. The only sounds the distant hum of machinery and the occasional beep from a monitor. I was exhausted, my mind foggy from lack of sleep. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I tried to focus on my work, but my thoughts kept drifting back toward C, to the strange events that had been happening. And then, out of nowhere, I heard a faint whisper, like someone speaking just outside my door. I froze, my heart racing. The voice was low, indistinct, but I could make out a few words. "Help me." I got up from my desk and opened the door, expecting to find one of the nurses or maybe a lost patient, but the hallway was empty, the lights dimmed for the night shift. I stood there for a moment, listening, but the whispering had stopped. Shaking my head, I tried to convince myself that it was just my imagination, a result of stress and fatigue. But as I turned to go back to my office, I felt a cold breeze brush past me, sending a shiver down my spine. And then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow, just at the edge of my vision. I spun around, but there was nothing there. I stood there, my heart pounding, trying to make sense of what I had just seen. But deep down, I knew. Ward C wasn't just haunted by the memories of the past, it was haunted by something much more real, something that was still very much alive in its own way. Over the next few weeks, the strange occurrences continued. More patients reported seeing figures in their rooms, hearing voices that no one else could hear. Some even claimed to feel a presence, something dark and malevolent, watching them. The staff started to avoid Ward C whenever possible, and those who had to work there did so with a sense of dread. One night I was called to the hospital for an emergency in Ward C. A patient had gone into cardiac arrest, and they needed my help. As I rushed down the hall, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that I was walking into a trap. When I arrived, I found the patient's room in chaos, nurses and doctors frantically trying to revive the man, but something was off. The air in the room was thick, oppressive, and the lights flickered as if struggling to stay on. I joined the efforts, but as I worked, I couldn't shake the feeling that we were being watched. And then, as we finally got the patient stabilized, I saw a figure standing in the corner of the room just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, with indistinct features, like a shadow given form. It watched us, unmoving, and I felt a wave of cold wash over me. No one else seemed to notice the figure, and when I looked again, it was gone. But the sense of dread lingered. Even after we had saved the patient's life that night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw that figure standing in the corner, watching me. The following morning, I went to the hospital administrator and told him what had been happening. I expected him to dismiss my concerns, but instead he looked at me with a seriousness I hadn't expected. "Dr. Lane," he said, "there are things about this hospital that we don't fully understand. Things that can't be explained by science or medicine. Ward C has always been ... different. There are stories, old stories, about what happened here long ago. People say the hospital was built on cursed land, that the spirits of those who died here are trapped, unable to move on." I listened in disbelief, but at the same time I couldn't deny what I had seen, what I had felt. There was something wrong with Hollow Creek Hospital, something beyond our understanding. In the end, there was nothing I could do but continue my work, trying to save lives, while knowing that something dark and terrible lurked in the shadows. Ward C remained a place of fear and mystery, a place where the living and the dead seemed to coexist in an uneasy truce. And every night, as I left the hospital, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched, that the spirits of Hollow Creek Hospital were still there, waiting for the next soul to join them. Growing up in a rural town, you hear a lot of stories, tales of haunted houses, strange lights in the sky, and creatures lurking in the woods are passed around like folklore. Most of us laugh them off, but deep down we all know someone who swears they've seen something. I've always been skeptical. That is, until one cold October night last year, when I found myself face to face with something that should never have existed. It started as a hunting trip. My buddy Rick and I had planned it for weeks, looking forward to spending a weekend in the woods away from everything. The plan was simple: drive out to a secluded area, camp, and hunt deer. The weather was perfect, with clear skies and a crispness in the air that made you appreciate the warmth of a campfire. We left early on a Friday morning, driving deep into the forest where the trees grew thicker and the roads turned to dirt. Rick had found a spot on an old map, a place where the deer were supposed to be plentiful and where we wouldn't be disturbed. It took us hours to get there, but when we finally arrived, it was everything we'd hoped for. The forest was dense, with towering pines and thick underbrush, and there wasn't another soul in sight. We set up camp near a small clearing, close to a creek that ran through the woods. The sound of the water was calming, and the isolation was exactly what we wanted. We spent the afternoon setting up our gear, making sure everything was in place for the next morning's hunt. As the sun began to set, we built a fire and settled in for the night, talking about everything and nothing. As the flames flickered in the dark, the first night was uneventful. We heard the usual sounds of the forest crickets, the rustling of leaves, the occasional hoot of an owl. It wasn't until the next day, when we were deep in the woods, that things started to feel off. We woke up early, before dawn, and headed out. The morning was cold, and the forest was shrouded in mist, giving everything an eerie quality. We hiked for hours, moving slowly and quietly, looking for signs of deer. But as the day went on, we noticed something strange. The woods were silent, too silent. There were no birds, no rustling in the underbrush, nothing. It was as if the forest was holding its breath. Rick was the first to mention it. "You notice how quiet it is?" he asked, his voice low. I nodded, not wanting to admit that it was starting to freak me out. The silence was unnatural, like the forest was hiding something. We kept going, but the further we went, the more uneasy I became. By midday, we still hadn't seen a single deer. Rick suggested we split up, thinking we might have better luck on our own. I wasn't thrilled about the idea, but I agreed. We decided to meet back at the camp in a few hours. I wandered through the woods, keeping my eyes peeled for any sign of movement. But all I found was more silence, the trees standing like sentinels around me. The longer I walked, the more lost I felt. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing thicker, the underbrush harder to navigate. The air was heavy, and the sky had turned a dull gray, blocking out the sun. It was then that I heard it, a low growl, deep and guttural, coming from somewhere behind me. I froze, every instinct screaming at me to run, but my feet felt like they were rooted to the ground. The growl came again, closer this time, and I turned slowly, my heart hammering in my chest. What I saw made my blood run cold. Standing in the shadows of the trees was a creature that defied explanation. It was tall, at least 7 feet, with the build of a bodybuilder and the head of a wolf. Its eyes glowed a sickly yellow, and its fur was dark and matted. The thing's mouth was open, revealing rows of sharp teeth, and its long arms ended in claws that looked capable of ripping through flesh. The creature stared at me, its eyes filled with a predatory intelligence. It took a step forward, and I finally snapped out of my daze. I turned and ran, crashing through the underbrush, not caring about the noise I was making. All I knew was that I had to get away. I could hear it behind me, moving through the trees with terrifying speed. I didn't dare look back. I ran blindly. My only thought was to get back to camp, to Rick, to safety. But the forest was disorienting, and in my panic, I had lost all sense of direction. The growling grew louder, closer, until it felt like the thing was right on top of me. My lungs burned, my legs ached, but I couldn't stop. I burst into a small clearing and skidded to a halt, my heart dropping when I saw that it was a dead end. Surrounded by cliffs on 3 sides, I was trapped. I spun around, my back pressed against the rock wall, as the creature emerged from the trees. It was even more horrifying up close. Its eyes locked onto mine, and it let out a snarl that made my blood turn to ice. This was it. I was going to die out here, alone in the woods, with no one to even know what had happened to me. The creature crouched, preparing to pounce, and I closed my eyes, waiting for the end. But then, out of nowhere, a gunshot rang out, echoing through the trees. The creature recoiled, letting out a roar of pain, and I opened my eyes to see Rick standing at the edge of the clearing, his rifle aimed at the beast. "Run," he shouted, and I didn't need to be told twice. I bolted past him, not stopping until we reached the camp. Rick was right behind me, firing another shot at the creature as we ran. It didn't follow us, and by the time we reached the camp, the only sound was our ragged breathing. We didn't waste any time. We grabbed what we could and left everything else behind, not stopping until we were in the truck and speeding down the dirt road, away from the forest, away from whatever the hell that thing was we never spoke about. What happened that day? We both knew no one would believe us, and even if they did, we didn't want to relive it. We never went back to those woods, and I haven't gone hunting since. I don't know what that creature was, but I know it was real, and I know that if Rick hadn't shown up when he did, I wouldn't be here to tell this story. I'd be just another name on the list of people who went missing in the woods, never to be seen again. When I first heard about Red Moon Lake, I was skeptical. I'd been living in the small town of Silver Hollow for just a few weeks, having moved from the city for a quieter life. The locals were friendly enough, but they had their superstitions, and Red Moon Lake was one of them. They said the lake was cursed, that anyone who went near it on a full moon night would disappear without a trace. Some claimed to have seen strange lights above the water. Others spoke of hearing voices that lured people into the depths, never to be seen again. Todd, as a journalist with a penchant for the unusual, I couldn't resist investigating the lake. I figured the stories were just that, stories, the kind of tales that small towns create to entertain themselves. But I wanted to see the place for myself, to find out if there was any truth behind the legends. It was late October, and the nights were growing colder. The moon was nearly full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape as I drove out to Red Moon Lake. The road was winding and narrow, surrounded by dense forest on both sides. I'd been warned not to go alone, but I wasn't one to be easily scared, and I wanted to experience the lake without any distractions. When I arrived, the first thing I noticed was how quiet it was. The lake was nestled in a valley surrounded by thick woods, and there wasn't a sound except for the gentle lapping of water against the shore. The air was crisp, and a light mist hovered over the surface of the lake, giving it an almost otherworldly appearance. I parked my car near the edge of the water and got out, taking a moment to breathe in the cool night air. The moon was high in the sky, its reflection shimmering on the dark water. I took out my camera and started taking pictures, hoping to capture something that might explain the stories. As I walked along the shore, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once. But there was no one there, just the trees, the lake, and the moon. I had been there for about an hour, taking notes and photos, when I heard a soft whisper, carried on the wind. I froze, straining to listen, but the sound was gone as quickly as it had come. I tried to brush it off as my imagination, but the feeling of unease persisted. I continued my exploration, making my way to a small dock that jutted out into the lake. The boards creaked under my weight as I walked to the end and looked out over the water. The mist was thicker here, swirling around the dock, and the moonlight gave it an almost ethereal glow. Then I heard the whisper again, this time louder, more distinct. It was a voice, soft and melodic, calling my name. My heart skipped a beat. How could anyone know I was here? The voice came again, beckoning me, drawing me closer to the edge of the dock. I peered into the water, but all I could see was my own reflection, distorted by the ripples. The voice was insistent, now urging me to come closer. My feet moved on their own, and before I knew it, I was standing at the very edge of the dock, staring down into the dark water. The voice was all around me, wrapping around me like a fog. It was soothing, almost hypnotic, and I felt an overwhelming urge to step into the water, to let the lake embrace me. But a small part of my mind was still rational, still aware that something was terribly wrong. I forced myself to take a step back, breaking the spell that had almost consumed me. As soon as I moved away from the edge, the voice stopped, and the mist began to recede. I stood there, my heart racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. I'd never experienced anything like it, and it shook me to my core. I hurried back to my car, the feeling of being watched stronger than ever. As I drove away, I couldn't shake the image of the lake from my mind, the way it had seemed to come alive, the way it had almost pulled me in. I didn't stop driving until I was back in town. The lights of Silver Hollow, a welcome sight after the eerie darkness of the lake. The next day, I tried to rationalize what had happened. Maybe it was just the wind playing tricks on me. Maybe the mist and the moonlight had created an optical illusion, making me see and hear things that weren't there. But deep down, I knew that wasn't the case. Something at Red Moon Lake had tried to lure me into the water, something that wasn't natural. I started asking around town, trying to find out more about the lake's history. Most people were reluctant to talk about it, but eventually I found an old man who was willing to share what he knew. He told me that the lake had been cursed for as long as anyone could remember. According to legend, a young woman had drowned there many years ago, and ever since, her spirit had been trapped in the lake, seeking revenge on the living. She was the one who lured people into the water, taking them to the depths where they would never be found. I didn't want to believe it, but after what I'd experienced, I couldn't dismiss it entirely. The more I learned, the more I realized that the disappearances were real. People had gone missing near Red Moon Lake, and their bodies had never been recovered. The locals believe that the lake was cursed, that it was best to stay away, especially on nights when the moon was full. But I couldn't leave it alone. I had to know more, had to understand what was really happening. I began to dig deeper, poring over old newspapers, records, anything I could find, and the more I uncovered, the more I realized that the curse was no mere superstition. There were accounts of strange lights hovering over the lake, of voices calling out from the water, of people being drawn to the lake and never returning. Some of the stories were old, dating back to the 1800s, while others were more recent. All of them spoke of the same thing, a force in the lake that was malevolent, something that sought to claim the souls of those who venture to close. I knew I had to go back. I had to see for myself, to understand what was really happening at Red Moon Lake. But this time I wasn't going alone. I convinced a couple of my friends to come with me, Sam, a local historian who had been helping me with my research, and Lisa, a photographer with a knack for capturing the supernatural. We decided to go on the night of the full moon, when the lake was said to be at its most dangerous. The drive out there was tense, none of us speaking much. The stories we'd uncovered weighed heavily on our minds, and even though we tried to laugh it off, there was a sense of foreboding in the air. When we arrived, the lake looked just as it had before, calm, still, and eerily beautiful under the light of the full moon. But there was an undercurrent of something dark, something that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. We set up our equipment near the dock, determined to document whatever happened. Sam had brought a recorder, hoping to capture any voices. Lisa started taking photos of the lake and the surrounding woods. I kept my camera rolling, not wanting to miss a thing. For a while, nothing happened. The night was quiet, almost too quiet, with only the occasional rustle of leaves in the breeze. But then, just as the moon reached its peak, the air around us grew cold, and the mist began to rise from the lake, thicker than before. We all felt it, a presence, something watching us from the water. And then the whispers started, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent. They called our names, one by one, echoing around us in a way that was impossible to pinpoint. Sam looked at me, his face pale. "You hear that?" he whispered. I nodded, trying to stay calm. "Stay together," I said. "Don't get too close to the water." But Lisa was already moving toward the dock, her camera in hand, her eyes wide with something between curiosity and fear. "I have to get a closer shot," she said, her voice distant. "No, Lisa," I shouted, but she didn't listen. She stepped onto the dock, the boards creaking under her weight, and I saw the same look in her eyes that I'd had the first time I was here, an almost trance-like state, as if something was drawing her in. I ran after her, grabbing her arm just as she reached the edge. "Lisa, stop," she snapped out of it, blinking as if waking from a dream. What just happened?" she asked, her voice shaking. "You were about to step into the lake," I said, pulling her back. "We need to get out of here." But before we could move, the whispers grew louder, more frantic, and the mist began to swirl around us, thicker than ever. I felt a tug, like something was trying to pull me toward the water, and I had to fight to stay on the dock. Then, out of the mist, we saw them figures, barely visible, hovering above the water. They were human-shaped, but translucent, their faces twisted in anguish. They reached out toward us, their mouths moving in silent screams. The old Wilshire manor had always been a source of fascination for me. I'd heard the stories about it, how it had been abandoned for decades, how strange lights and shadows were seen moving through its windows at night. Most of the town's residents avoided the place, convinced it was cursed. But I wasn't one to be easily deterred by rumors. As an aspiring paranormal investigator, I saw it as an opportunity to uncover the truth. It was late autumn when I decided to explore Wilshire Manor. The air was crisp, and the leaves crunched underfoot as I made my way to the estate. The mansion stood on a hill, its dark silhouette outlined against the setting sun. Even in the daylight, there was something ominous about it. Its once grand architecture now seemed decrepit and foreboding. I parked my car at the base of the hill and made my way up the overgrown path to the front door. The gate was rusty and barely hanging on its hinges, and the lawn was littered with fallen leaves and debris. The house itself looked like it had been frozen in time, its windows boarded up and the paint peeling away. Despite its dilapidated state, there was an undeniable air of mystery surrounding it. As I approached the door, I noticed strange symbols carved into the wood. They were old and faded, but still visible. I'd read about occult practices associated with the house, and seeing these symbols made the stories seem all the more real. I pushed open the door, which creaked loudly, and stepped inside. The interior was just as I had imagined, dusty and neglected, with cobwebs hanging from the corners. The ground floor was filled with old furniture, covered in sheets, and the air was thick with the smell of mildew. I turned on my flashlight and began to explore, documenting everything with my camera. The first few rooms were unremarkable: an old parlor, a library filled with rotting books, and a dining room with a long, dust-covered table. But as I ventured deeper into the house, I began to feel a growing sense of unease. The temperature seemed to drop noticeably, and the silence was almost oppressive. In the basement, I found what I was looking for: a hidden door behind a stack of old crates. It was small and inconspicuous, but something about it made me want to investigate further. I pried the door open, revealing a narrow staircase leading down into darkness. I descended the stairs, my flashlight casting long shadows on the walls. At the bottom, I found a small, underground chamber. It was filled with strange artifacts, old, dusty books, peculiar trinkets, and what looked like ritualistic items. There was an altar in the center of the room, covered in dust and cobwebs, and a faded pentagram drawn on the floor. As I examined the artifacts, I felt a sudden chill, and my flashlight flickered. I tried to ignore it, focusing instead on the items in the chamber. But then I heard a whispering voice coming from somewhere behind me. I spun around, but there was no one there. The voice was faint, almost inaudible, but it was definitely there. I moved cautiously toward the source of the sound, my flashlight beam cutting through the darkness. The whispers grew louder, and I could make out words, though they were still indistinct. It sounded like a chant or incantation, repeated over and over. I backed away slowly, my heart racing. I knew I had to leave, but as I turned to go, I saw something in the corner of the chamber, a figure, barely visible in the shadows. It was tall and indistinct, but its presence was unmistakable. It watched me silently, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. I fled up the stairs, the whispers following me, growing louder and more frantic. I stumbled through the house, trying to find my way back to the front door. The temperature seemed to drop even further, and the air was filled with an oppressive weight. Finally, I burst through the front door and ran down the hill, not stopping until I was safely in my car. I looked back at the manor, but the darkness had swallowed it up, and I could see nothing but the silhouette of the house against the night sky. The following day, I went back to town and tried to learn more about the history of Wilshire Manor. What I found was both intriguing and disturbing. The house had been built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family who were rumored to be involved in occult practices. They had disappeared under mysterious circumstances, and the house had been abandoned ever since. Local legends spoke of rituals performed in the basement, of strange occurrences and disappearances linked to the house. Some believe that the spirits of the family were still trapped there, bound by the rituals they had performed. Others thought that the house was cursed, a place where dark forces had taken root. I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something more to the stories, something that went beyond mere superstition. The whispers I had heard, the figure I had seen, they all pointed to something real, something that defied explanation. I decided to do a more thorough investigation, bringing in a team of experts in the paranormal. We set up equipment throughout the house, hoping to capture evidence of the supernatural. As we worked, we encountered strange phenomena, cold spots, unexplained noises, and occasional glimpses of shadowy figures. One night, as we were conducting a seance in the basement, the atmosphere became charged with energy. The whispers returned, louder and more urgent. We could see the shadows moving, forming shapes that seemed to pulse with a life of their own. The air grew thick and heavy, and the temperature dropped sharply. Then the figure I had seen before appeared once more, its form clear now. It seemed to be trying to communicate, its movements jerky and erratic. We tried to make contact, but the figure remained silent, its intentions unclear. The seance ended abruptly when the figure vanished, and the room returned to its previous state of calm. We reviewed the footage and recordings, and while we captured some intriguing evidence, there were no definitive answers. In the end, we had to leave Wilshire Manor behind with more questions than answers. The house remained a place of mystery, its secrets still hidden in the darkness. For me, the experience was a reminder of the thin boundary between the known and the unknown, and the enduring power of the supernatural. Wilshire Manor stands as a testament to the legends and mysteries that surround it, a place where the past and present collide, and where the whispers of the unknown continue to echo through the halls. I've always been a nature lover, the kind of person who finds peace in the quietude of the wilderness. There's something about being surrounded by trees, with nothing but the sounds of birds and the rustle of leaves, that brings me a sense of calm. That's why, when I heard about the blood moon, I decided it would be the perfect time to go on a solo hike through the Redwood Trail. I'd heard the stories, of course, but I didn't put much stock in them. Every small town has its legends, and as far as I was concerned, they were just that, legends. The hike was supposed to be straightforward, a day-long trek up to the ridge, where I could watch the blood moon rise over the valley, then a night spent in a tent before heading back down in the morning. The weather was perfect, crisp and clear, and the trail was well marked and easy to follow. I had all the supplies I needed, and I felt confident that I could handle anything that came my way. The first part of the hike was uneventful, just as I had expected. The trail wound through dense forest with towering redwoods on either side. The sunlight filtered through the canopy, casting dappled shadows on the ground. It was beautiful, serene. I stopped a few times to take pictures and drink in the scenery, but for the most part, I kept a steady pace, wanting to reach the ridge before dusk. As the afternoon wore on, the trail became steeper, and the trees began to thin out, giving way to rocky terrain. I could see the ridge ahead, a jagged line against the sky, and I pushed myself to reach it before the sun set. By the time I made it to the top, the sky had turned a deep shade of orange, and the first stars were beginning to appear. I set up my tent at the edge of the ridge, where I had a clear view of the valley below. The forest stretched out as far as the eye could see, a sea of dark green that faded into the distance. I unpacked my gear, made a small fire, and settled in to wait for the moon to rise. As I sat by the fire, the sky grew darker, and the stars came out in full force. There was no sound except the crackling of the fire and the occasional hoot of an owl. It was peaceful, almost too peaceful. I found myself glancing over my shoulder more than once, but there was nothing there, just the darkness and the trees. Finally, the blood moon began to rise. It was a sight to behold, a large, crimson orb that seemed to hang low in the sky, casting an eerie red glow over the landscape. I grabbed my camera and started taking pictures, marveling at the beauty of it. But as the moon climbed higher, I began to notice something strange. The forest below looked different, as if it was shifting, moving. At first I thought it was just a trick of the light, but as I stared down at the trees, I realized that they were indeed moving, swaying in a way that was unnatural. It was as if the forest itself was alive, reacting to the presence of the blood moon. I felt a chill run down my spine, and I turned away from the edge, trying to shake off the feeling of unease. But the sense of being watched, of something lurking in the shadows, was growing stronger. I told myself it was just my imagination, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was very, very wrong. I decided to call it a night and crawled into my tent, zipping it up tight. I lay there for a while, listening to the sounds of the forest, but everything was unnervingly silent. No wind, no animals, nothing. Just the deafening silence that seemed to press in on me from all sides. I must have drifted off at some point, because the next thing I knew, I was jolted awake by a sound outside my tent. It was faint at first, a soft rustling, like something moving through the leaves. I held my breath, straining to hear. The rustling grew louder, closer, and I could hear footsteps, slow, deliberate, as if someone or something was circling my tent. My heart was pounding in my chest, and I reached for the flashlight I had left by my side. I clicked it on and shone the beam through the fabric of the tent, but the light did nothing to dispel the darkness outside. The footsteps stopped, and for a moment there was only silence, and then something brushed against the side of the tent, lightly at first, then harder, as if it was testing the material. I could see the outline of a hand, or what looked like a hand, pressing against the fabric. It lingered there for a moment, then slid down the side of the tent, leaving a faint trail in its wake. I scrambled to unzip the tent and stepped out into the cold night air, my flashlight sweeping the area around me. But there was nothing, no sign of anyone or anything. The fire had burned down to embers, casting long shadows across the ground. I stood there, breathing heavily, trying to make sense of what had just happened, and then I saw it movement in the trees at the edge of the ridge. I turned the flashlight towards it, and my breath caught in my throat. There, just beyond the reach of the light, was a figure. It was tall, almost impossibly tall, with long, thin limbs and a face that I couldn't quite make out. It was watching me, its eyes glowing faintly in the darkness. I backed away slowly, my mind racing. What was it? How long had it been watching me? The figure didn't move, didn't make a sound, but its presence was overwhelming, suffocating. I could feel its gaze boring into me, and I knew I had to get out of there. I grabbed my backpack and started down the trail, moving as quickly as I could without running. I didn't look back, didn't stop until I reached the bottom of the hill and my car. I threw my gear into the back seat and peeled out of there. not daring to look in the rearview mirror. It wasn't until I was miles away, with the lights of the town in the distance, that I finally allowed myself to breathe. I pulled over to the side of the road, my hands shaking, and tried to calm down. I couldn't explain what had happened up there, but I knew one thing for sure: I wasn't going back. When I got home, I tried to put the experience behind me, but it stayed with me, haunting my dreams. I researched the area, trying to find any explanation for what I had seen, but all I found were more tales of strange creatures that appear during the blood moon, of hikers who had gone missing, never to be found. I don't know what I encountered that night, but I do know that it was real. I could still see its eyes glowing in the darkness, watching me, and I knew deep down that it was still out there, waiting for the next blood moon, ready to claim its next victim. I've always considered myself a pretty rational person. I don't believe in ghosts or the supernatural, and I've never had a reason to. That's why when I started noticing small, strange things happening around my house, I brushed them off as nothing more than my imagination. Little did I know my life was about to take a turn into something I couldn't explain, something that still haunts me to this day. It all started with the noises. At first, they were barely noticeable, just a creak here, a thud there. It's an old house, I told myself. It's just settling, but the noises grew louder, more distinct. Footsteps in the hallway, the sound of doors closing on their own, the distant echo of something dragging across the floor. Each time I convinced myself it was nothing, but deep down I felt a growing sense of unease. One night, after a long day at work, I came home to find my front door slightly ajar. I distinctly remembered locking it that morning. My first thought was that I had been careless, but when I stepped inside, I noticed something even more unsettling. The furniture in my living room had been moved, nothing drastic, just a few inches here and there, but enough to notice. My first instinct was to call the police, but I quickly dismissed the idea. What would I tell them? That my couch moved a few inches? They'd think I was crazy. I went through the house, checking every room, every closet, but there was no one there. Nothing was missing, and everything else seemed to be in order. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong. I double-checked all the locks and went to bed, but sleep didn't come easily at night. Over the next few days, the strange occurrences became more frequent. I would come home to find lights turned on that I was sure I had left off, objects out of place, and once I even found a glass of water on the kitchen counter that I had no memory of pouring. My friends laughed it off, telling me I was probably just stressed and needed a vacation, but I knew something was happening, something I couldn't explain. Then came the night that everything changed, the night the uninvited guest made itself known. It was a Friday, and I had decided to spend the evening at home, trying to relax. I had just finished dinner and was sitting on the couch, flipping through channels on the TV, when I heard the unmistakable sound of footsteps on the stairs. My heart skipped a beat as I muted the TV and listened. The footsteps were slow and deliberate, moving steadily up the stairs. I froze, every muscle in my body tense, as the footsteps reached the top of the stairs and then stopped. I waited, holding my breath, but there was nothing but silence. Gathering what little courage I had, I got up and slowly made my way to the stairs. The hallway light was on, casting a dim glow over the stairs. That there was no one there. I stood at the bottom, staring up into the empty hallway, my mind racing with possibilities. Was someone in the house? Had they been here all along, hiding, watching me? As I stood there, paralyzed with fear, I heard a creak above me, the sound of a floorboard shifting under weight. It was coming from my bedroom. I felt my stomach drop as I realized that whoever or whatever was in the house was now in my room. I grabbed the nearest thing I could find, a heavy metal flashlight, and slowly started up the stairs. Each step felt like an eternity, the silence of the house pressing in on me. When I reached the top, I hesitated, my hand trembling as I reached for the door to my bedroom. Taking a deep breath, I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was dark, the only light coming from the hallway behind me. I scanned the room, my eyes darting to every shadow, every corner, but there was nothing, no one. I was about to turn and leave when I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The closet door, which I always kept closed, was slightly open. My heart pounded in my chest as I took a step toward it, gripping the flashlight tightly. I reached out with my free hand, fingers brushing against the cold wood of the door. Before I could open it, the door creaked open on its own, revealing nothing but darkness inside. My breath caught in my throat as I stared into the black void of the closet. And then, from the depths of that darkness, I heard it, a whisper, faint, almost inaudible, but unmistakable, leave. I stumbled back, my heart racing as I fumbled for the light switch. The room flooded with light, and I saw that the closet was empty. But the whisper had been real, I was sure of it. I backed out of the room, not taking my eyes off the closet, and slammed the door shut behind me. I didn't sleep that night. I stayed in the living room, every light in the house on, my ears straining for any sound, but there was nothing. The house was silent, almost too silent, as if it was holding its breath, waiting. The next morning, I packed a bag and left. I didn't know where I was going, I just knew I couldn't stay in that house any longer. I stayed with a friend for a few days, trying to convince myself that it had all been in my head, but deep down I knew the truth. When I finally went back to the house, it was like walking into a tomb. The air was heavy, the silence oppressive. I couldn't bring myself to go upstairs, not after what had happened. I moved out a week later, leaving behind everything I couldn't carry with me. I didn't care, I just wanted to be as far away from that house as possible. I never went back. I never wanted to know what was really in that house, what had whispered to me that night. But sometimes in the dead of night, when the world is quiet and I'm alone with my thoughts, I can still hear that whisper. And I wondered, did I leave or did it follow me? It was a rainy Friday night in November when I found myself huddled under a narrow awning, trying to shield myself from the downpour as I waited for a taxi. The city was bustling, as usual, but the relentless rain seemed to have dampened everyone's spirits. Street lights flickered in the distance, casting a ghostly glow over the wet pavement. It had been a long day at work, and all I wanted was to get home, put my feet up, and forget about the world for a while. I watched as taxi after taxi drove by, all occupied, their yellow lights blinking as they sped through the puddles. My umbrella was useless against the wind, which had picked up and was driving the rain sideways. Just as I was beginning to think I'd never get a cab, one finally pulled up to the curb. The driver, a middle-aged man with a graying beard and tired eyes, leaned over and pushed open the passenger door. Without hesitation, I climbed in, grateful to be out of the storm. "Where to?" the driver asked, his voice gruff but not unfriendly. I gave him my address, and he nodded, pulling away from the curb and merging into the sparse traffic. I settled back into the seat, the hum of the engine and the patter of rain on the roof lulling me into a state of near relaxation. For the first few minutes, the ride was uneventful. We drove through the quiet streets, the city lights blurred by the rain-splattered windows. The driver didn't say much, which was fine by me. I wasn't in the mood for small talk. But as we drove further into the city, I began to notice something strange. The route we were taking wasn't the usual one I took home. At first I thought it might just be a shortcut the driver knew, a way to avoid the usual traffic. But as the streets became less familiar, winding through areas I didn't recognize, I started to feel uneasy. The buildings we passed were old, their facades crumbling and dark, as if they had been abandoned for years. There were no other cars, no pedestrians, just the rain and the occasional flicker of a street lamp. "Are we going the right way?" I asked, trying to keep the nervousness out of my voice. The driver glanced at me in the rearview mirror, his expression unreadable. "Shortcut," he muttered, his eyes flicking back to the road. I didn't press the issue, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The air inside the cab felt heavy, almost suffocating, and the temperature seemed to have dropped several degrees. I pulled my coat tighter around me, trying to ward off the sudden chill. As we continued to drive, the sense of unease grew stronger. The buildings around us became more decrepit, their windows shattered, and their walls covered in graffiti. It was as if we had entered a part of the city that time had forgotten, a place that had been left to decay and rot. The street lights became fewer and farther between, and soon we were driving through near total darkness. My heart began to race, and I considered asking the driver to stop and let me out, but something told me that would be a mistake. The driver's demeanor had changed. He was tense, his hands gripping the steering wheel tightly, his eyes darting from side to side as if he was looking for something or someone. The rain had intensified, the downpour now a relentless barrage against the cab's roof. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up, their frantic movements barely making a dent in the sheet of water obscuring the view. And then, without warning, the car came to a sudden stop. I looked out the window, but there was nothing to see, just darkness and rain. We were in the middle of an empty street, no signs, no buildings, nothing. The only sound was the steady drumming of the rain and the soft hiss of the cab's engine. "What's going on?" I asked, my voice trembling. The driver didn't respond. He just sat there, staring straight ahead, his knuckles white as he gripped the steering wheel. I could see sweat beading on his forehead. Despite the cold, "Is everything okay?" I asked again, louder this time. The driver finally turned to look at me, his eyes wide with fear. "They're here," he whispered, his voice barely audible over the rain. Before I could ask who he meant, there was a loud bang on the roof of the cab, followed by another, and then another, as if something or someone was trying to get in. Panic surged through me, and I reached for the door handle, but the door wouldn't budge. I tried the other door, but it was the same, locked or jammed. I was trapped. I looked at the driver, but he was frozen, his eyes fixed on the rearview mirror. "They always find me," he said, his voice hollow. "No matter where I go, they always find me." I didn't understand what he was talking about, but I didn't have time to ask. The banging on the roof grew louder, more insistent, and then the car began to shake, as if it was being rocked back and forth by some unseen force. I could hear voices now, low and guttural, whispering things I couldn't make out, but that filled me with a deep sense of dread. "Let me out," I screamed, pounding on the window with my fists, but it was no use. The car continued to shake, the voices growing louder, and then, with a sudden jolt, the engine died, plunging us into complete silence. The driver turned to me, his face pale and drawn. "I'm sorry," he said, and then he reached for something under his seat. Before I could react, he pulled out a small, leather-bound book and began to mutter something under his breath, a prayer or an incantation, I couldn't tell. The voices outside the car grew louder, more frantic, and then, with a deafening roar, the roof of the cab caved in. I screamed, covering my head as debris rained down on me. But when I looked up, I saw nothing, just the inside of the cab, intact, the roof where it had always been. The driver was gone. I was alone in the cab, the rain still pounding against the windows. The car was no longer shaking, and the voices had stopped. I sat there, stunned, my heart racing as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. I reached for the door handle again, and this time it opened easily. I stumbled out into the rain, looking around frantically, but there was no sign of the driver, or of whatever had been attacking the car. The street was empty, silent, as if nothing had happened. I was soaked to the bone, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to calm myself down. I had no idea where I was, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get as far away from that cab as possible. I started walking, my legs shaking, my mind racing. After what felt like hours, I finally saw the faint glow of street lights in the distance, and I broke into a run, desperate to reach safety. When I finally made it back to my apartment, I was exhausted, both physically and mentally. I collapsed onto my bed, my clothes still wet, and fell into a deep, dreamless sleep. The next morning I woke up feeling groggy, my mind foggy with the memory of the night before. I checked my phone for any messages, but there was nothing. I tried to convince myself that it had all been a nightmare, but when I checked the weather, I saw that it had indeed rained the night before. I knew what had happened was real, and I was never going to forget it. I called the taxi company to report what had happened, but when I gave them the cab number, the dispatcher told me that there was no record of the cab ever being on the road that night. I checked my phone for the receipt, but it was gone, as if the ride had never happened. I tried to move on, to put that night behind me, but I can't shake the feeling that it's not over. Sometimes, when I'm out walking late at night, I feel like I'm being watched. I'll hear footsteps behind me, or catch a glimpse of a shadow out of the corner of my eye, but when I turn around, there's no one there. I stop taking taxis, and I avoid walking alone at night as much as possible. But I know deep down that they're still out there, whatever they are, and one day they'll find me again. It was supposed to be a typical camping trip, a weekend getaway in the remote wilderness to escape the noise and stress of the city. My friends and I had planned it for weeks, a chance to reconnect with nature, sit around a campfire, and enjoy some peace and quiet. We had no idea that we were about to experience something that would haunt us for the rest of our lives. There were 5 of us: me, my best friend Alex, his girlfriend Rachel, her brother Mark, and our mutual friend Sophie. We'd all been friends since college, and this trip was meant to be a fun reunion. We chose a secluded spot deep in the woods, far from any other campers or civilization. The perfect place to unwind, or so we thought. We arrived late in the afternoon, set up our tents, and gathered wood for the fire. As the sun began to set, we lit the fire and sat around it, roasting marshmallows and telling stories. The woods were eerily quiet, with only the crackling of the fire and the occasional rustle of leaves breaking the silence. But none of us paid much attention to it. We were too busy enjoying each other's company. As the night wore on, we decided to turn in. We were tired from the long drive and eager to get some rest before exploring the area the next day. We doused the fire, zipped up our tents, and settled in for the night. I was sharing a tent with Alex, while Rachel, Mark, and Sophie were in their own tents nearby. I don't know how long I had been asleep when I woke up to a strange sound. At first I thought it was just the wind, but as I listened more closely, I realized it was something else, something unnatural. It was a low, guttural growl, coming from somewhere just outside the tent. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. As I strained to hear what it was, Alex stirred beside me, muttering something in his sleep. I reached over and shook him awake. "Alex, did you hear that?" I whispered, my voice trembling. "Hear what?" He mumbled, still half asleep. "That growling sound. It's coming from outside." He sat up, rubbing his eyes, and listened. The growling had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that hung in the air like a thick fog. But then we heard it again, closer this time. A deep, menacing growl that sent a chill down my spine. "What the hell is that?" Alex whispered, his voice barely audible. "I don't know," I replied, my mind racing with possibilities. A bear? Maybe, but this didn't sound like any bear I had ever heard. It sounded ... wrong. We grabbed our flashlights and cautiously unzipped the tent. The night was pitch black, the trees looming like dark shadows against the starless sky. We shone our flashlights around, trying to see what was making the noise, but there was nothing, just the dense, impenetrable darkness of the forest. Suddenly, the growling started again, louder this time, and coming from all around us. It was as if whatever was out there was circling our campsite, watching us from the shadows. We could hear the underbrush rustling, twigs snapping underfoot, but we couldn't see a thing. "Get back inside," Alex hissed, pulling me back into the tent. We zipped it up quickly, our hearts racing as the growling grew louder, more aggressive. Whatever was out there, it was getting closer. We heard Rachel scream from her tent, followed by the sounds of Mark and Sophie yelling. They had heard it too. We grabbed our knives, our only means of protection, and waited, listening as the growling circled our camp, moving from tent to tent. And then, just as suddenly as it had started, the growling stopped. The silence that followed was deafening, suffocating. We waited, holding our breath, expecting something to happen. But nothing did. Minutes passed, but it felt like hours. Finally, Alex spoke. "We need to get out of here," he said, his voice steady but tense. "Whatever that thing is, it's not safe to stay here." I nodded in agreement, my mind racing with fear and adrenaline. We quickly packed up our things, trying to be as quiet as possible, but every sound we made seemed amplified in the stillness of the night. We huddled together, flashlights in hand, as we made our way to the car, which was parked a short distance away. The woods were eerily silent, the only sound our footsteps crunching on the forest floor. But just as we reached the edge of the campsite, we heard it again, the growling, coming from directly behind us. We turned around, our flashlights sweeping across the trees, and that's when we saw it. A pair of glowing eyes, reflecting the light from our flashlights, staring at us from the darkness. And then, as if stepping out of a nightmare, it emerged from the shadows. It was huge, easily 7 feet tall, with the body of a man, but covered in thick, dark fur. Its face was elongated, like that of a dog, with sharp, pointed ears and a snout full of razor-sharp teeth. It stood on 2 legs, hunched over slightly, its claws digging into the ground as it watched us. With those glowing eyes, we stood there, frozen in terror. As the creature took a step forward, its growl deepening into a low, menacing rumble. Alex raised his knife, but it felt like a futile gesture against something so monstrous, so otherworldly. For a moment, time seemed to stand still. The creature stared at us, its eyes burning with an unnatural intelligence, as if it was deciding what to do with us. And then, just as suddenly as it had appeared, it turned and disappeared into the trees, leaving us standing there, shaking with fear and disbelief. We didn't wait to see if it would come back. We ran, sprinting through the woods toward the car, not daring to look back. We could hear it moving through the trees behind us, its growls echoing in the night. But we didn't stop. We reached the car, jumped in, and sped away, not stopping until we were miles away from the campsite. We never spoke about what happened that night. We all knew what we had seen, but none of us wanted to acknowledge it. How could we? It was impossible. Something out of a horror movie, not real life. But I know what I saw. We all did. And I'll never forget those glowing eyes staring at us from the darkness, or the feeling of being hunted by something that shouldn't exist. To this day, I don't know what that creature was. Some kind of animal, a werewolf, a demon. All I know is that it was real, and it was out there, lurking in the shadows of the forest, waiting for its next victim. It was a crisp autumn afternoon when my friend, Mark, and I decided to take a road trip. We were both history enthusiasts, always seeking out places with dark pasts and untold stories. Mark had heard about an old abandoned asylum that lay deep in the woods, about 2 hours from the city. It wasn't a popular tourist spot. Most people in the area didn't even know it existed, but that only made it more intriguing to us. We packed some snacks, grabbed our cameras, and set off, eager to explore the decaying remnants of what was once a place of unimaginable suffering. The drive was peaceful at first. We passed through quaint towns and rolling countryside, the vibrant colors of fall painting the landscape in hues of orange, red, and gold. But as we got closer to our destination, the scenery began to change. The trees grew denser, their branches twisting together to form a thick canopy that blocked out the sunlight. The road narrowed, becoming little more than a gravel path lined with weeds and overgrown bushes. "This place is really off the grid," Mark remarked, glancing at the GPS on his phone. The signal had cut out about 10 minutes ago, leaving us to rely on the handwritten directions he had jotted down before we left. "I guess that's why it's still standing," I reply, peering out the window at the woods that seemed to close in around us. The further we drove, the more uneasy I felt. There was something oppressive about the forest, as if it were alive, watching us as we ventured deeper into its heart. Finally, after what felt like hours, we arrived at the asylum. It loomed before us, a massive stone structure partially hidden by the trees. The building was in ruins, its walls cracked and crumbling, windows shattered, and the roof partially collapsed. The once grand entrance was now a gaping maw, its doors long gone, leaving only a dark void that seemed to beckon us inside. We parked the car and got out, the silence of the forest pressing down on us. There were no birds, no rustling leaves, just an eerie stillness that made the hair on the back of my neck stand up. Mark didn't seem to notice he was already walking toward the building, his camera slung over his shoulder, his eyes gleaming with excitement. "Come on, let's check it out," he called back to me, his voice echoing off the stone walls. I hesitated for a moment, but then followed him, not wanting to be left alone outside. As we approached the entrance, I couldn't help but feel a sense of dread. The air was heavy, thick with the scent of damp earth and decay. The shadows inside the asylum seemed to shift and move, as if something was lurking just out of sight. Mark stepped through the doorway without a second thought, but I paused, taking one last look at the forest behind us. The trees were still, their branches unmoving despite the breeze that had picked up. I took a deep breath and stepped inside. The interior of the asylum was just as decayed as the outside. The walls were covered in peeling paint and graffiti, and the floor was littered with debris, broken glass, rotting wood, and remnants of old furniture. The air was damp and musty, and the only light came from the dim, gray sky filtering through the shattered windows. Mark was already snapping photos, his camera clicking away as he explored the main hallway. "This place is incredible," he said, his voice echoing in the empty space. "Can you imagine what it was like when it was still in use?" I nodded, though I couldn't shake the feeling that we shouldn't be here. There was something wrong about this place, something that made my skin crawl. As we walked further into the building, the sense of unease grew stronger. The walls seemed to close in around us, the darkness growing thicker with each step. We wandered through the asylum, exploring the various rooms and corridors. Most were empty, their contents long since looted or destroyed, but some still held remnants of the past: rusted bed frames, decaying mattresses, and old medical equipment, all covered in layers of dust and grime. The deeper we went, the more oppressive the atmosphere became. It was as if the building itself was alive, breathing, waiting for something. We came across a large metal door at the end of one hallway. It was different from the others, heavier, more secure, as if it was meant to keep something inside. Mark, of course, was immediately intrigued. "Help me get this open," he said, grabbing the handle and pulling with all his might. I hesitated, but then joined him, the door creaking as it slowly gave way. The smell that hit us when the door finally opened was overwhelming: stale, putrid air that had been trapped for decades. We coughed and covered our noses, but Mark was undeterred. He shone his flashlight into the room beyond, revealing a set of stairs leading down into darkness. "No way," I said, taking a step back. "We're not going down there. Come on, where's your sense of adventure?" Mark teased, already descending the stairs. I wanted to stop him, to tell him we should leave, but the words caught in my throat. Something was pulling me toward that darkness, a morbid curiosity that I couldn't resist. Reluctantly, I followed him down the stairs, the air growing colder and more suffocating with each step. The stairs were narrow and steep, the walls closing in around us as we descended deeper into the bowels of the asylum. When we finally reached the bottom, we found ourselves in a long, narrow corridor lined with doors on either side. The air was thick with the stench of rot and mildew, and the walls were damp, water seeping through the cracks in the stone. "This must have been the basement," Mark said, his voice barely above a whisper, "where they kept the most dangerous patients." I didn't respond, my eyes fixed on the door at the far end of the corridor. It was slightly ajar, and there was a faint light coming from inside. Mark saw it too and started toward it, but I grabbed his arm. "Maybe we should just go," I said, my voice trembling. "I don't like this place." Mark shook me off. "We've come this far. Let's just see what's in there, and then we can leave." He pulled away and continued down the corridor, his footsteps echoing off the stone walls. I followed him, my heart pounding in my chest. The closer we got to the door, the stronger the sense of dread became. The light coming from the room was strange, not the harsh, artificial light of a bulb, but a soft, flickering glow, like candlelight. When we reached the door, Mark pushed it open the rest of the way, revealing a small, circular room. The walls were lined with shelves, each one filled with dusty jars and vials, their contents long since dried up or decayed. In the center of the room was a large stone table, stained with dark, rusty spots. On the table was an open book, its pages yellowed with age, covered in strange symbols and writing I couldn't understand. Mark walked over to the table, his eyes wide with fascination. "This is incredible," he said, reaching out to touch the book. "Don't I warn?" But it was too late. The moment his fingers brushed the pages, the air in the room seemed to shift, growing colder and heavier. The candle light flickered, and the shadows on the walls began to move, writhing and twisting like they were alive. Mark jerked his hand back, his face pale. "Did you feel that?" he asked, but I couldn't respond. My attention was fixed on the shadows, which were no longer just flickering. They were taking shape, forming into dark, human-like figures that moved toward us. "We need to leave now," I said, grabbing Mark's arm and pulling him toward the door. But the moment we turned to leave, the door slammed shut with a deafening bang, plunging the room into darkness. Panic surged through me, and I fumbled for my flashlight, my hands shaking. When I finally managed to turn it on, the beam cut through the darkness, revealing the figures that were now surrounding us. They were tall, their forms indistinct, like they were made of smoke or shadow. Their eyes glowed with a cold, malevolent light, and they moved closer, their movements slow and deliberate. Mark was frozen, his eyes wide with terror. "What do we do?" he whispered, his voice barely audible over the pounding of my heart. "I don't know," I reply, my voice shaking. "But we need to get out of here." I pointed the flashlight at the door, but the beam of light was weak, barely illuminating the handle. I reached for it, my fingers trembling as I tried to turn it, but it wouldn't budge. The shadows were closing in, their presence suffocating, and I could feel the cold seeping into my bones. "Please, let us out," I whispered, my voice breaking. I wasn't sure who I was begging: the shadows, the building itself, or whatever malevolent force had trapped us here. The figures stopped moving, their glowing eyes fixed on us. For a moment there was silence, the air heavy with anticipation, and then, without warning, the door swung open, flooding the room with light. Mark and I didn't hesitate. We bolted out of the room, racing down the corridor and up the stairs, our footsteps echoing in the darkness. We didn't stop running until we were outside, the cold night air hitting us like a slap in the face. We stumbled to the car, breathless and shaking, and drove away as fast as we could, not daring to look back. It wasn't until we were miles away that we finally spoke. "What the hell was that?" Mark asked, his voice shaky. "I don't know," I replied, still trying to catch my breath. "But we're never going back there." We didn't talk much for the rest of the drive, the silence heavy with the weight of what we had experienced. When we finally got back to the city, we parted ways, both of us eager to forget what had happened. But I couldn't forget. The images of those shadowy figures haunted my dreams, their glowing eyes staring into my soul. I tried to convince myself that it was just a trick of the light, a result of our overactive imaginations. But deep down I knew the truth. We had disturbed something in that asylum, something that was never meant to be found. A few days later, Mark called me. He sounded different, his usual enthusiasm and confidence replaced by something darker. He told me he had been having nightmares, seeing those same figures in his sleep. He was convinced that they were still watching him, waiting for the right moment to strike. I tried to reassure him, but I couldn't shake the feeling that he was right. There was something about that place, something evil that had latched onto us the moment we set foot inside. Mark stopped answering my calls a few weeks after that. I went to his apartment, but it was empty. No sign of him, no note, nothing. It was like he had just vanished. I reported him missing, but the police didn't find any leads. It was as if he had never existed. I've tried to move on, to forget about what happened, but every now and then I feel like I'm being watched, like there's something lurking just out of sight, waiting for the right moment to strike. And sometimes, late at night, I'll catch a glimpse of a shadow moving in the corner of my eye, a reminder of the darkness we uncovered in that forgotten asylum. "Jonathan," he said, sliding a file across his desk toward me, "I've got a challenging property for you. Blackwood Manor." I looked at the file, recognizing the name immediately. "Isn't that place supposed to be haunted?" I asked, half joking, But there was a hint of nervousness in my voice. Mr. Thompson sighed, rubbing his temples. That's just a bunch of nonsense. The house is old, yes, and it's been vacant for a long time. But that's no reason why we can't sell it. The owners are desperate, and they're willing to accept a much lower offer. I need you to make it happen. I wasn't thrilled about the assignment, but I needed the commission. The real estate market had been slow, and I couldn't afford to turn down work, so I agreed. The next day I made my way to Blackwood Manor. The drive out there was unsettling. The road twisted and turned through the thick woods, the trees towering overhead like silent sentinels. The closer I got to the house, the darker the sky seemed to grow, as if the very air around the manor was thick with shadows. When I finally arrived, I parked my car at the end of the long, gravel driveway and took in the sight before me. Blackwood Manor was massive, its dark, weathered exterior looming over the landscape like a forgotten relic. The windows were boarded up, the paint peeling from the walls, and the garden was overgrown with weeds and vines. Despite its dilapidated state, there was something majestic about the house, a hint of the grandeur it must have once possessed. But there was also an air of sadness, as if the house itself was mourning its lost glory. I approached the front door, the wooden steps creaking under my weight. The key I had been given turned easily in the lock, and the door swung open with a loud groan, revealing a dark, dusty hallway. The air inside was stale, carrying the scent of old wood and decay. I stepped inside, feeling the temperature drop instantly. It was much colder in the house than it had been outside, and a chill ran down my spine. I shook it off, telling myself it was just the age of the building and the fact that it had been closed up for so long. The first thing I did was go through the house, room by room, taking notes and photos. The place was massive, with 3 stories, a basement, and an attic. The rooms were large and spacious, with high ceilings and ornate moldings that hinted at the wealth of the original owners. But time had not been kind to Blackwood Manor. The walls were cracked, the floors creaked with every step, and there were signs of water damage in several places. Despite the house's size, it felt suffocating, as if the walls were closing in on me. There was a heaviness in the air, an oppressive atmosphere that made it difficult to breathe. As I made my way to the second floor, I heard it, a faint sound, like the soft rustling of fabric, or perhaps the whisper of a distant voice. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. I was alone in the house, or at least I was supposed to be. I listened intently, but the sound had stopped. I shook my head, trying to dismiss it as my imagination playing tricks on me. But as I continued to explore the house, the sound returned, this time louder, more distinct. It was coming from one of the bedrooms at the end of the hall. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see a sliver of darkness beyond. I hesitated, every instinct telling me to turn back, to leave the house, and never return. But curiosity got the better of me. I pushed the door open and stepped inside. The room was empty, just like the others. There was an old 4-poster bed covered in a thick layer of dust, and the curtains were drawn, casting long shadows across the floor. But the air was colder here, and the sound was louder, clearer. It was a woman's voice, whispering something I couldn't quite make out. The hair on the back of my neck stood on end, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I backed out of the room, my heart racing, and quickly made my way back downstairs. I told myself it was just the wind, or perhaps some animal that had gotten inside. But deep down, I knew it was something else. I decided to finish my inspection quickly and leave. I didn't want to be in that house any longer than I had to. As I entered the living room, I noticed something strange. There was a large, old-fashioned mirror hanging on the wall, the glass cloudy and covered in dust. But there was something else reflected in it, something that shouldn't have been there. A figure, faint and shadowy, standing just behind me. I spun around, but there was nothing there. The room was empty. I turned back to the mirror, but the figure was gone. My hands were shaking, and I could barely hold the camera steady as I took the last few photos. I wanted to get out of there as fast as possible. I finished up, locked the door behind me, and practically ran to my car. I didn't stop until I was back in town, where the streets were busy and the air felt warm and safe again. I tried to tell myself that it was just an old house, that my mind had been playing tricks on me because of the stories I'd heard. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching me, that something had followed me from that house. The next few days were a blur. I tried to focus on other properties, other clients, but my thoughts kept drifting back to Blackwood Manor. I started having nightmares, vivid dreams of being trapped in the house, unable to escape the shadows that lurked within. Then strange things started happening. I would hear footsteps in my apartment at night, soft but unmistakable. Objects would move on their own, small things, like a book or a pen, but enough to unsettle me. One morning I woke up to find a word leaf scrawled on my bathroom mirror in what looked like condensation. Even though I hadn't used the shower, I knew then that whatever was in Blackwood Manor had followed me home. I was being haunted, and I didn't know what to do. I tried to ignore it, to go about my life as if nothing was wrong, but the hauntings grew more intense, more violent. Doors would slam shut on their own, lights would flicker, and I would hear whispers in the darkness, always just out of reach. One night I woke up to find my bed shaking, as if something was trying to drag me out of it. I couldn't move, couldn't scream, couldn't do anything but lie there in terror until it finally stopped. I knew then that I couldn't stay in my apartment. I packed a bag and left, checking into a hotel on the other side of town. But even there the hauntings continued. No matter where I went, I couldn't escape the presence that had attached itself to me. In desperation, I reached out to a local historian, someone who knew the history of Blackwood Manor better than anyone else. She was an elderly woman, well respected in the community, and she agreed to meet with me. We sat down in a small cafe, and I told her everything that had happened. She listened intently, her expression growing more serious with each detail I revealed. When I was finished, she sighed heavily. "You're not the first," she said, her voice tinged with sadness. "There have been others who've encountered the spirit of Blackwood Manor. The house was built in the late 1800s by a wealthy family, the Blackwoods, but their fortune was built on the suffering of others. Mr. Blackwood was a cruel man, known for his harsh treatment of his servants and workers. His wife, Eleanor, was said to be a kind woman, but she died under mysterious circumstances. Some say she was murdered by her husband, others say she took her own life. But after her death, strange things began happening in the house. People reported seeing her ghost, hearing her voice, feeling her presence. The house changed hands several times after that, but no one stayed for long. The hauntings drove them away. I felt a cold knot of fear in my stomach. Is there any way to get rid of it, to make it stop? She shook her head. Spirits like hers are bound to the place of their death. They're trapped, unable to move on. The only thing you can do is stay away from the house and hope that whatever followed you will eventually lose its hold. It wasn't the answer I wanted, but it was the only one I had. I thanked her and left, feeling more lost and afraid than ever. I didn't return to my apartment. I couldn't. Instead, I moved to a different town, far away from Blackwood Manor. But even there, the hauntings persisted. It was as if the spirit had become a part of me, a shadow that I couldn't shake. The whispers, the footsteps, the strange occurrences, they all continued no matter where I went. I tried to find peace, to live a normal life, but it was impossible. The hauntings were a constant reminder of the darkness that had attached itself to me. I lost friends, I lost jobs, and eventually I lost my mind. As I sit here, writing this, I can feel it watching me, just out of sight. It's always there, waiting, reminding me of the day I stepped into Blackwood Manor and brought something back with me that should have stayed buried. And I know that no matter how far I run, no matter where I go, I will never be free. It was my third week on the job as a night security guard at a sprawling industrial complex on the outskirts of town. The pay was decent, the hours were manageable, and best of all, it was usually quiet. The complex housed several warehouses, each storing different types of goods ranging from electronics to furniture. My job was to patrol the area, check the security systems, and ensure that everything was secure. There was one building, however, that I had been told to avoid unless absolutely necessary. Warehouse 13. It was an old, decrepit structure that had been there long before the rest of the complex was built. The other guards would joke about it, saying it was haunted, but I didn't pay much attention. I wasn't one to believe in ghost stories. On this particular night, my shift started like any other. I did my rounds, checked the cameras, and settled into the small security office to monitor the feeds. The night dragged on uneventfully, with only the occasional rustling of trees or the distant hum of traffic breaking the silence. Around midnight, I decided to do another round of the complex to keep myself awake. As I walked through the dimly lit corridors between the warehouses, I found myself drawn toward Warehouse 13. I wasn't sure why. Maybe it was curiosity, or maybe it was just a desire to prove to myself that there was nothing to the stories. Whatever the reason, I made my way to the entrance of the old building. Flashlight in hand, the door creaked as I pushed it open, the sound echoing in the vast, empty space inside. The warehouse was dark, with only the faint glow of the moonlight filtering through the dirty, broken windows. The air was thick with dust, and the smell of mildew lingered in the air. I shone my flashlight around, revealing rows of old, rusting shelves and abandoned crates. As I moved deeper into the warehouse, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. It was an unsettling sensation, like there were eyes on me from every corner of the room. I tried to brush it off as nerves, but the feeling only grew stronger the further I went. Suddenly, I heard a noise, a faint whispering sound, so soft that I almost thought I was imagining it. I stopped in my tracks, holding my breath as I listened. The whispering grew louder, more distinct, as if someone or something was speaking in a language I couldn't understand. I turned in the direction of the sound, my flashlight trembling in my hand. The beam of light landed on a shadowy figure at the far end of the warehouse, just beyond the reach of the light. It was tall, impossibly tall, with long, twisted limbs that seemed to stretch toward the ceiling. The figure stood there, motionless, its features obscured by the darkness. My heart raced as I took a step back, the flashlight slipping from my grasp and clattering to the floor. The noise echoed through the warehouse, and in that moment the figure moved. It took a slow, deliberate step forward, the sound of its footsteps like nails scraping across a chalkboard. I stumbled backward, my eyes locked on the figure as it continued to advance. My mind was screaming at me to run, to get out of there, but my legs felt like they were made of lead. The whispering grew louder, more insistent, filling my head with a sense of dread that I couldn't shake. Finally, my instincts kicked in, and I turned and bolted for the door. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps growing louder, faster, as it chased me through the warehouse. The door seemed impossibly far away, but I pushed myself to keep running, my breath coming in ragged gasps. I burst through the door and slammed it shut behind me, my hands shaking as I fumbled to lock it. I leaned against the door, trying to catch my breath, my heart pounding in my chest. The whispering had stopped, replaced by an eerie silence that hung in the air like a heavy fog. I didn't wait to see if the figure would follow. I ran back to the security office, locking the door behind me and collapsing into the chair. I could still feel the presence of whatever had been in that warehouse, like a dark cloud looming over me. I couldn't shake the feeling that I had narrowly escaped something far worse than I could imagine. The rest of my shift passed in a blur of fear and anxiety. I kept my eyes glued to the security monitors, but nothing seemed out of the ordinary. The complex was as quiet as ever, but I knew that something was out there, lurking in the shadows of Warehouse 13. When morning finally came, I handed in my resignation. I couldn't stay there, not after what I had experienced. As I left the complex for the last time, I glanced back at Warehouse 13. The building stood there, silent and foreboding, as if daring me to return. I never did, and I never spoke of what happened that night. But every now and then I find myself wondering what would have happened if I hadn't run. What would that figure have done if it had caught me? And what secrets does Warehouse 13 hold that the world was never meant to know? It all started when my friends and I decided to rent a cabin for a weekend getaway. We were a tight-knit group, always up for an adventure, and this time we wanted to escape the city and immerse ourselves in nature. The idea was simple: 3 days of hiking, fishing, and just enjoying the tranquility of the wilderness. The cabin we chose was deep in the woods, about a 3-hour drive from the nearest town. It was an old, rustic place that had been around for decades, if not longer. The owner, an elderly man named Mr. Grayson, had warned us that the cabin was isolated with no cell service and only a landline for emergencies. We didn't mind. In fact, that was part of the appeal. We wanted to disconnect from the world and reconnect with each other. We left on a Friday afternoon, packed into a couple of cars with all the essentials: food, drinks, camping gear, and plenty of firewood. The drive was uneventful until we left the main road and started down the narrow, winding path that led to the cabin. The trees grew denser, their branches forming a canopy overhead that blocked out most of the sunlight. The further we drove, the darker it became, even though it was still early in the afternoon. By the time we reached the cabin, the sun was setting, casting long shadows across the clearing where the cabin stood. It was exactly what we had imagined: a small wooden structure with a stone chimney, surrounded by trees on all sides. There was a sense of serenity about the place, but there was also something else, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. A heaviness in the air, as if the woods themselves were watching us. We shrugged it off, attributing it to the eeriness of being so far from civilization. After unloading our gear and settling in, we decided to explore the area. There was a small lake nearby, its surface perfectly still, reflecting the sky like a mirror. The woods were quiet, but we chalked it up to the isolation. As night fell, we built a fire in the cabin's fireplace and settled in for the evening. We talked, laughed, and shared stories, enjoying each other's company. The cabin was cozy, with its creaky wooden floors and old furniture that had clearly seen better days. But as the hours passed, the atmosphere began to change. It started with the sound of footsteps on the porch. At first we thought it was just an animal, maybe a deer or a raccoon, but the footsteps were too heavy, too deliberate. They moved slowly, almost methodically, around the cabin. We all fell silent, listening intently. The footsteps stopped just outside the door. We exchanged nervous glances, but no one dared to move. Then, as suddenly as they had started, the footsteps continued, circling the cabin once more before fading into the distance. We tried to laugh it off, convincing ourselves that it was nothing, just our imaginations running wild. But the unease lingered. That night I barely slept. Every creak, every rustle of the wind outside made my heart race. The cabin, which had seemed so inviting just hours before, now felt like a trap, its wooden walls closing in on me. The next morning, we woke up to find that one of our friends, Mark, was missing. His bed was empty, his belongings untouched. We searched the cabin, the surrounding woods, calling his name, but there was no sign of him. Panic set in. We couldn't understand how he could have just vanished without a trace. The landline in the cabin was dead, the cord cut, and without cell service, we were completely cut off. The rest of the day was spent searching. But as the hours passed and the sun began to set, our hope of finding him dwindled. We returned to the cabin, exhausted and terrified. That night the footsteps returned. This time they were louder, more insistent. They circled the cabin over and over, as if whatever was out there was taunting us. We huddled together, too scared to move, too scared to even breathe. And then the knocking started, slow, deliberate knocks on the door, the windows, the walls. It was as if something was trying to get in, trying to find a way inside. We blocked the door with furniture, but it didn't stop. The knocking continued for what felt like hours, echoing through the cabin until, finally, it stopped. The silence that followed was even more terrifying. We didn't sleep that night. We just sat there, waiting for the dawn, praying that the daylight would bring some sense of normalcy. But when the sun finally rose, we were faced with an even more horrifying sight. The front door was wide open, and Mark's body was lying on the porch, his eyes wide open, staring into nothing. His face was frozen in an expression of pure terror. We didn't know what to do. We were in shock, paralyzed by fear and grief. But we knew we had to leave, had to get out of those woods before whatever had taken Mark came for us. We grabbed our things and ran, not stopping until we reached our cars. We drove back to town as fast as we could, not daring to look back. When we finally made it to the nearest police station, we told them everything. They went back to the cabin, but by then it was too late. The cabin was empty, and Mark's body was gone. The authorities searched the area, but they never found any trace of him or whatever had taken him. The official story was that he had gotten lost in the woods and died of exposure, but we knew the truth. We had all seen the look on his face, the terror in his eyes. Something had been in that cabin with us, something that wasn't human. We never spoke of it again, but the experience haunted us. We drifted apart after that, each of us dealing with the trauma in our own way. As for me, I moved away, far from the woods, far from anything that reminded me of that cursed cabin. But no matter how far I go, I can't escape the memory of that weekend. The footsteps, the knocking, Mark's lifeless eyes, those images are burned into my mind, a constant reminder that some places are better left undisturbed, and that sometimes when you venture too deep into the woods, you might not come back. It was the kind of cold that seeps into your bones, the kind of night where every sound seemed amplified by the stillness of the woods. I was out hunting with my two buddies, Jake and Mason. We had decided to spend the weekend in the deep wilderness of northern Michigan, hoping to bag some deer. We had done this plenty of times before, but this night was different. This night something was watching us. We set up camp just before sunset, our small fire crackling in the middle of the clearing. The tall pines towered above us, their branches swaying gently in the cool wind. We were miles from civilization, completely alone, or so we thought. After dinner, we decided to head out for a night hunt. The moon was almost full, casting an eerie glow over the landscape, making the shadows stretch and dance around us. We moved quietly, our breath visible in the frigid air as we made our way through the dense forest. The first sign that something was wrong came when we noticed the silence. The woods, usually alive with the sounds of rustling leaves, the chirping of crickets, and the occasional hoot of an owl, had fallen completely silent. It was as if the forest was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. Jake was the first to speak up, his voice barely more than a whisper. "You guys hear that?" he asked, stopping in his tracks. Mason and I exchanged uneasy glances. I hadn't heard anything, but the look on Jake's face told me that he had. His eyes were wide, scanning the trees around us. "What is it?" I asked, gripping my rifle a little tighter. Jake shook his head, his face pale. "I don't know. It sounded like a howl, but not like any animal I've ever heard." We stood there for a moment, listening. And then, just as I was about to dismiss it as Jake's imagination, I heard it too, a low, guttural howl that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere at once. It was deep, resonant, and utterly unnatural. My blood ran cold. "That didn't sound like a wolf," Mason said, his voice trembling slightly. He was trying to keep calm, but I could see the fear in his eyes. "No," I agreed, my heart pounding in my chest. "It didn't." We stood there, frozen in place, our senses on high alert. The howl came again, this time closer, and I felt a chill run down my spine. Whatever it was coming for us. "Let's get back to camp," Jake said, his voice tight with fear. We turned and started making our way back through the trees, moving as quickly and quietly as we could. But the woods were like a maze in the dark, and every direction looked the same. The howls continued, growing louder and more frequent, each one sending a jolt of terror through my body. Suddenly, Mason stopped dead in his tracks, his flashlight beam catching something in the distance. "What the hell is that?" he whispered. I followed his gaze and felt my stomach drop. Standing at the edge of the clearing, just beyond the reach of our lights, was a massive figure. It was unlike anything I had ever seen before, standing on two legs, easily 7 feet tall, with broad shoulders and a muscular build. Its body was covered in dark, matted fur, and its head was that of a canine, with pointed ears, a long snout, and glowing yellow eyes that seemed to pierce the darkness. The creature stood there, watching us, its breath visible in the cold night air. It bared its teeth, revealing a set of sharp, glistening fangs, and let out a low growl that reverberated through the woods. My instincts screamed at me to run, but I couldn't move, paralyzed by the sheer terror of what I was seeing. Jake, the most level-headed of the three of us, was the first to break the spell. "We need to get out of here," he hissed, his voice trembling. Now we turned and ran, our footsteps pounding against the forest floor as we fled from the creature. The howls grew louder, closer, as if the beast was right on our heels. The forest seemed to close in around us, the trees a blur as we sprinted through the darkness. I could hear Jake and Mason just ahead of me, their breath ragged with fear, but the howls were deafening now, echoing in my ears, and I knew the creature was gaining on us. I could feel its presence, the ground shaking with each of its steps as it pursued us relentlessly. We burst into the clearing where our camp was, and I barely had time to process what was happening. The creature was right behind us, and I could feel its hot breath on the back of my neck. I didn't stop running until I was inside the tent, grabbing my rifle and fumbling to load it with trembling hands. But it was too late. The beast was upon us. Jake and Mason were shouting, but their voices seemed distant, drowned out by the blood rushing in my ears. I turned just in time to see the creature lunge toward Jake, its massive jaws snapping shut inches from his face. Jake fired his rifle, the shot ringing out in the night, but it barely seemed to slow the creature down. Mason screamed as the beast turned its attention toward him, its yellow eyes glowing with an unnatural light. He tried to run, but the creature was too fast, its powerful legs propelling it forward in a blur of motion. It tackled Mason to the ground, its claws digging into his flesh as it pinned him down. I don't know how I found the strength, but I raised my rifle and fired at the creature. The shot hit its shoulder, and it howled in pain, a sound that sent a shiver down my spine. It released Mason and turned toward me, its eyes burning with rage. For a moment I thought it was going to tear me apart, but then it let out a final, agonized howl and disappeared into the woods, leaving a trail of blood in its wake. The silence that followed was deafening. I stood there, my rifle still raised, staring at the spot where the creature had vanished. Jake was on his knees, gasping for breath, while Mason lay on the ground, clutching his bleeding wounds. We were alive, but barely. We didn't stay to find out if the creature would return. We packed up what we could and left the woods that night, driving through the darkness in silence, too shaken to speak. None of us ever spoke of what happened that night again, but the memory of those glowing yellow eyes and that bone-chilling howl haunts me to this day. I don't know what we encountered in those woods, and I don't want to know. All I know is that I'll never go back, and I'll never forget the night we came face to face with the dogman.